Hey guys, tonight we're pulling back the thick embroidered curtain on something everyone tiptoes around when talking about medieval marriages, the wedding night. You've seen it in films, candles flickering, nervous glances, the slow disrobing to soft lute music. Yeah, that's not what really happened. The truth? You probably won't survive this, not because it's scary, but because it's so awkward, uncomfortable, and historically horrifying your toes might curl straight off your feet. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your city and what time it is where you're watching. I love seeing how far this sleepy storytelling goes. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It starts, as most good dramas do, in a church that smells faintly of damp stone, beeswax and unwashed feet. The wedding ceremony in the Middle Ages is not exactly romantic. You're standing there beside your beloved, whom you might have met yesterday, or maybe never, or maybe she's your third cousin twice removed who's been traded to your family in exchange for 10 goats and a partial vineyard. If you're lucky, there's some music. If you're really lucky, you're sober. But honestly, probably not. There's a good chance you had a few celebratory ales by now, because the wedding's been going on for hours, or even days, depending on your status. Nobles like to party, peasants like to party, everyone likes to party, especially when there's meat involved, which is a big deal in an age when bread is the main food group and spices are more expensive than land. And the church, well, it's the spiritual backbone of this entire affair. Priests have set the rules, and there are a lot of rules. You're standing there with your soon-to-be spouse repeating vows in Latin you probably don't understand, with some very serious-looking people around you, some of whom may be tasked with following you afterward. Because this isn't just a marriage of hearts, it's a public contract. And part of that contract? The union must be consummated. Yes, even God has to know that the thing was sealed in the bedroom, or the barn, or the castle hallway. Location is surprisingly flexible. Now imagine this. The ceremony ends, people cheer, bells ring, or someone just yells, "Is done," depending on how rich you are, and off you go. In today's world, the couple usually heads off to a hotel suite or some romantic getaway. But in medieval times, you're not escaping anyone. The procession from the church to the bedroom is not a private. In fact, it's often more like a parade, especially if you're nobility. Your entire court might follow you back to your chamber. Music playing, wine spilling, people singing about what you're about to do. If you're a peasant, maybe it's a smaller crowd, but someone's definitely keeping an eye on that bed. And then there's the bedding ceremony. Yep, that's a real thing. Depending on the region and century, you might be formally put to bed by family, friends, or clergy. The bride gets undressed, sometimes by her mother, sometimes by her ladies-in-waiting, sometimes, by the crowd. Same with the groom. Everyone's laughing, teasing, maybe tossing in a few crude jokes. A few brave souls might even hang around to witness the first moments of consummation. Because again, it's not just about love. This is evidence. This marriage won't count unless it's proven. You lie down, possibly in a ceremonial bed draped with sheets gifted by both families. Someone hands you a cup of spiced wine. Someone else offers unsolicited advice. If you're a noble, a scribe might be waiting outside to record the hour, the mood, and, let's be real, the outcome. And once the doors are shut, well, hopefully they do get shut. But even then you're not alone. Servants might linger behind curtains. A priest might wait outside the door with a prayer on his lips and a suspicious ear pressed to the wood. Privacy? That's a modern invention. Back then your wedding night was everyone's business. Here's the kicker. Most people getting married aren't even sure what they're supposed to do. Especially if they're young. Medieval nobles often married early, girls as young as 12, boys not much older. And although it was common knowledge that sex was required to finalise a marriage, detailed information was often filtered through religious warnings, vague analogies or tavern gossip. So imagine being a terrified teenager suddenly expected to perform with your future, your family's honour and possibly a crowd of people counting on you. No pressure, right? Now let's talk about the venue. The wedding night could happen anywhere. A feather-stuffed bed in a candlelit castle, a straw pallet in a smoky farmhouse, or even outside if the celebration got out of hand. One odd detail, in some places the marital bed wasn't just for you two. No, it was common to have guests sleep nearby, or even in the same room. Imagine trying to concentrate while your uncle is snoring 3 feet away. Cosy. Historically speaking, there's at least one documented case where villagers gathered around the house and banged pots and pans to cheer the couple on, or possibly to make them hurry up. It's like medieval cheering, or maybe mild harassment. Hard to say. Here's a weird one. In some areas of France and Germany, after the couple went to bed, their undergarments were thrown out the window as proof the event had commenced. Hopefully it was a warm night. There's scholarly debate over just how much of this was ceremonial and how much actually happened in practice. Some historians argue that the more dramatic bedding rituals were reserved for royalty and the upper nobility, while peasants likely skipped the public bits and just got on with it. Others claim that even common folk upheld at least a symbolic version of the process. One thing's clear, the line between public and private was not just blurry, it was practically non-existent. So here you are, lying next to someone you might barely know, expected to consummate a relationship while your family, your church, and possibly half your village is involved in some way. Romantic? Depends on your definition. Terrifying? Almost certainly. But one thing's for sure, it's nothing like what the fairy tales would have you believe. You're lying there, the flickering fire casting soft shadows across the stone walls. When it hits you, everyone expects this to be a tidy, sacred event, but you've got no idea where to put your hands, or your face, or your expectations. But expectations are everything in a medieval wedding night, especially for the bride. Because if there's one thing the entire system hinges on, it's the fragile, fraught, and frequently misunderstood concept of virginity. She's veiled, demure, and draped in layers of symbolism as much as fabric. The white dress trope didn't really exist yet, but purity? Oh, that was the main course. For noble families, a virgin bride wasn't just a preference, it was a financial investment. Marrying off your daughter meant securing alliances, merging estates, and sometimes even avoiding war. Her body was political property, and virginity, that was the receipt. Now, what does virginity even mean in this context? That's where things get tricky. Medieval medicine was a bit foggy on anatomy. They believed in a literal virgin's seal that could be physically broken, ideally accompanied by blood. If no blood appeared, eyebrows rose, whispers followed. Entire inheritances could unravel over a sheet that didn't stain red. Never mind that hymens vary wildly between women, and some girls bled from horseback riding or never bled at all. Facts weren't really a thing yet. What mattered was perception. Before this awkward attempt at consummation even began, your new wife may be terrified. She's been told that this is her duty, that pain is part of it, and that her worth may hang on what happens next. There's even advice floating around for noble brides on how to submit. Lie still, close your eyes, think of God. Super romantic, right? Meanwhile, you're expected to take charge, to complete the act with no hesitation, no affection required. And if you're both underage, yikes. Let's just say, a lot of medieval marriages were legally binding but delayed in the bedroom until the couple hit puberty, if anyone cared enough to wait. Of course, this all depends on your class. If you're nobility, you're bound by strict codes and scrutinised by everyone from the local bishop to your extended cousins. But if you're a peasant, it's less formal, more functional. A village girl's virginity is still valuable, sure, but it's not a political crisis if things don't go by the book. That said, even among the lower classes, the community expects some form of proof, be it gossip, a bloody sheet, or the bride walking funny the next morning. Subtlety wasn't exactly the cultural vibe. There's one weird ritual worth mentioning here. In some Scandinavian regions, it was customary for the bride's friends to guard her chamber door while the groom fought his way in, symbolically claiming his wife. Was it play acting? Was it terrifying? Probably both. These customs blurred the lines between metaphor and real physical dominance. And heaven help the couple if they actually liked each other. Affection could be seen as weakness, or at the very least suspicious. The veil you saw at the altar isn't just fashion, it's loaded with meaning. For centuries it symbolised both purity and obedience. Unveiling the bride was a charged moment. Sometimes the groom lifted it just before the vows, and sometimes not until they were alone. But there were also traditions where the veil wasn't removed at all until the consummation was over. The idea was that her purity was so sacred, even her face was too powerful to be revealed before the act was done. Honestly, how anyone got anything done while wrapped in this much symbolic pressure is beyond comprehension. And don't forget the family. Some mothers-in-law, especially among noble families, felt it was their right, even duty, to oversee the deflowering. That's right, supervision. Some even claimed to offer guidance, though their presence would somehow make things smoother. And if that makes your skin crawl, you're not alone. There are recorded complaints, often in hushed diary entries or cloaked in church petitions, of brides who felt traumatised by this process, but the structure of medieval society made resistance difficult. Women were trained to obey, to serve, and to endure. There's an open scholarly debate about how much autonomy women truly had in these scenarios. Some argue that medieval women were more passive victims of a brutal patriarchy. Others suggest that women, especially noble women, knew how to manoeuvre behind the scenes, managing households, wielding influence, and even delaying consummation through clever tactics. There are records of brides who suddenly became ill on their wedding night, or who fainted dramatically at just the right moment. Coincidence? Maybe. Survival strategy? Absolutely. One historical tidbit you probably haven't heard. In some regions of Italy, if a groom failed to produce blood on the wedding night, he could hire a witness to vouch for the act having occurred. This was often a friend or relative who just stood near the room and listened. If that sounds like a worst-case Airbnb experience, it was. In rare cases, if even that wasn't enough, the couple had to reenact the moment partially clothed before a notary. That's right. Bureaucratic bedroom drama. For the record, this often happened during annulment hearings, but still, the fact that it was even on the menu? Wild. And it wasn't just the woman who was judged. Male performance mattered too. If the groom couldn't perform, the marriage could be annulled. Entire trials were built around whether a man could achieve, shall we say, operational status. There are stories of grooms forced to demonstrate their abilities in front of a panel of monks and midwives. Can you imagine the anxiety? No wonder some chose the celibate life of a monastery instead. But for tonight, let's assume things are moving forward. Maybe clumsily, maybe quietly, maybe with the help of a few generous goblets of wine. The bed creaks, the veil comes off, the nervous laughter fades, and the two of you are finally alone, or at least mostly alone. Somewhere in the background a candle flickers, somewhere outside a rooster crows prematurely, and in that moment all the pressure, all the ceremony, all the symbolism just collapses into a tangled heap of human awkwardness. You might not know what love is, you might not even like each other, but you've just crossed a line from childhood to adulthood, from theory to practice, and whether this marriage lasts a lifetime, a week, or a single disastrous encounter, it's officially real now. So here you are, legs tangled in scratchy linen, the air heavy with candle smoke and expectations, and you're just starting to relax when you hear it. A cough from behind the curtain, or maybe the shuffle of boots just outside the door. Because here's the fun part. You're not alone. Not really. Welcome to the unnervingly common practice of witnessed consummation. Yes, believe it or not, for a large chunk of the Middle Ages, especially among the noble and royal classes, the wedding night was a spectator sport. Sometimes literal. Your chamber door might stay ajar, someone might peek through, and in the worst-case scenario, a few high-ranking officials might be sitting right there, watching from a bench, sipping wine, and waiting for a signal that the deed was done. You might think this sounds like a rare, exceptional case. You'd be wrong. This wasn't fringe behaviour, it was protocol. Let's rewind a bit. In medieval Europe, marriage was a legal contract as much as a spiritual one. Land, titles, bloodlines, and power were all at stake, and the only thing more important than marrying was proving you'd actually consummated the union, because that's what made it legally binding in both secular and church law. If it wasn't consummated, it didn't count. The contract was void. All those alliances, poof. So how do you make sure no one lies about doing the deed? You witness it. Now, witnessing didn't always mean a full-blown audience in the room, although sometimes it did. More often a trusted group, friends, family members, servants, would accompany the couple to the bedroom, help undress them, yes, help, maybe tuck them in, maybe say a prayer or toss a joke, and then wait just outside the door. Once the moment happened, the groom might shout something like, "It is done." Or, if they were really committed to tradition, throw a piece of the bride's nightclothes out the door as proof. The church didn't exactly love this practice, but it tolerated it, especially for high-profile couples where a disputed marriage could cause, say, a war. There are accounts of clergy being present, not just praying but observing. In some noble households, this wasn't even seen as awkward, it was duty, a legal safeguard. And depending on your region, customs varied. In England, things were a bit more discreet. In France and parts of Germany, not so much. The weirdest version? A royal bedding ceremony where the couple was led to bed with trumpets, watched by the court and then, no joke, clergy blessed the bed. Everyone stood around nodding solemnly like they were attending a christening, not preparing two teenagers for a night of terrified fumbling. And when the curtain was finally drawn or the door shut, the witnesses stayed nearby, listening. But it wasn't just about seeing or hearing. Sometimes they wanted proof. The bloody sheet, for example, the now infamous symbol of virginity. If the sheet bore blood, it was paraded around triumphantly the next morning. Guests might toast to it. Servants might carry it around. Occasionally it was even hung outside for the village to see, flapping in the breeze like the world's most awkward banner. But if there was no blood, well then things got complicated. A family might accuse the bride of impurity. The groom might be pressured to declare he could not complete the act. And you better believe there were legal consequences for either outcome. In fact, there were actual court cases, real legal trials where virginity was disputed. Midwives were brought in to examine the bride. Neighbours testified. It was horrifying. One case from 14th century France included a judge asking whether the bride's body was too tightly closed for natural congress. So yeah, romance was pretty dead. On the flip side, some brides found clever ways to manufacture a little theatrical blood. Animal parts, pig's blood, sponges soaked in red wine, all were rumoured tricks to fool the crowd. These tactics weren't just desperate, they were survival. Because a woman accused of not being a virgin could be sent back to her family in disgrace beaten, or worse. Meanwhile, the groom wasn't exactly under less pressure. If he failed to perform, the marriage was considered incomplete. A man's ability to produce an erection was not only a personal issue, it was a legal matter, and not just once. He had to consistently perform to ensure the marriage was valid and children could be produced. No pressure, right? There are even stories of noble women petitioning for annulments by claiming their husbands were impotent. In one case, a man had to strip and prove his functionality before a panel of church-appointed experts. Imagine being that guy. One eyewitness from a 16th century annulment trial in Spain described a court-appointed examiner lifting the man's robes, poking around, and declaring with great formality that he did not appear suited to the marital task. Translation: "Oh, buddy, your wife gets to leave you." And here's a quirky fact that makes all this even more awkward. Some bedding ceremonies included musicians playing lively tunes outside the chamber to cover the sounds. It was like a medieval mixtape, only everyone else picked the playlist. If the musicians stopped early, everyone knew something had happened. If they kept going for a while, well, that led to gossip. Of course, not every couple went through this gauntlet. Peasant marriages, for instance, were far less ceremonious. Though consummation was still essential for the marriage to be recognised by the community and the church, it was usually done in privacy, at least more privacy than their noble counterparts. But even in villages, neighbours were nosy. People talked. The absence of certain sounds, or the presence of too many, was enough to get tongues wagging. Bedroom walls were thin, and gossip was thick. Scholars still argue about just how common public or semi-public consummation was. Some believe the more extreme accounts are outliers reserved for royalty and high nobility, with most commoners enjoying at least a sliver of privacy. Others argue that the culture of surveillance, of treating sex as communal proof, was so deeply embedded that even peasants couldn't escape it entirely. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. So as you lie there under the pressure of veils, vows, and half a dozen eavesdropping witnesses, one thing is clear. This night isn't about tenderness. It isn't even about desire, it's about proof, about fulfilling the expectations of family law and religion. You may not remember what anyone said during the vows, but you'll remember the sound of someone coughing outside the door while you fumble through the most stressful performance of your life. And just in case you were hoping it'd be over quickly, congratulations, the entire estate will be talking about it at breakfast. So the witnesses have gone, or maybe they haven't, and the first night jitters are now a weird blend of awkward silences, crumpled linens, and the faint echo of hymns no one quite finished. But don't get too comfortable, because in the Middle Ages, your bedroom habits aren't just your business, they're God's. Enter the church, that ever-watchful, ever-judging institution that not only marries you, but also likes to micromanage your sex life in staggering detail. Welcome to the sacred world of sanctioned intimacy, where even your pillow talk is under theological review. You might think the church would just be happy the marriage was consummated and move on. Nope, they had opinions, many, many opinions, and they wrote them down, in dense, intimidating volumes. Whole manuals were produced by monks who probably hadn't been on a date in their lives, yet somehow found time to dictate exactly how when and why married couples could unite in flesh. Spoiler. Most of the time they strongly preferred that you didn't. Let's start with the rules. You're only supposed to have sex for procreation, not pleasure, not bonding, not because you're bored and it's raining. If your mind wanders even a little during the act, say you think about someone else or worse, enjoy it too much, that's a sin. If you do it on a Sunday, a holy day or during Lent, sin. During daylight hours, sin. If it's too noisy, probably a sin. There were times of the week and year where even married sex was banned outright. You could go months being married and still not be allowed to do it without offending God. And don't get too creative either. The only approved position was, brace yourself, missionary. That's it. No improvisation, no switching things up, no, we're in love and want to express it differently. Just good old-fashioned duty, with man on top and the woman lying there like she's being read a bedtime psalm. If you deviated from this holy geometry, the church could accuse you of sodomy, even in a heterosexual context. That's right, sodomy wasn't just a same-sex charge. It applied to any sexual act that didn't strictly follow the reproductive playbook. Some confessors even kept charts of when it was okay to have sex. Tuesdays and Fridays? Generally frowned upon. Wednesdays were kind of a toss-up. Sundays? Definitely not. Feast days? Absolutely not. The period leading up to Easter? Forget about it. Some devout couples went entire seasons abstaining, not because they didn't want to, but because they feared eternal damnation over a few minutes of intimacy. And for people who truly internalised this, the wedding night became less of a romantic milestone and more of a spiritual minefield. Now let's talk about the confessional. That little wooden box with a sliding panel and a very serious man behind it. He wanted to know everything. After the wedding night, sometimes the very next day, newlyweds were expected to confess their sins, which included any sexual acts that veered too close to pleasure. Imagine being a trembling teenager, knees on cold stone, whispering through a screen that maybe, just maybe, you enjoyed consummating your marriage, then waiting to be assigned a penance for it. We're talking prayers, fasting, or in some cases, temporary abstinence, as if you hadn't just waited half your life for this moment. And yet this wasn't always purely negative. The church believed sex, in its proper form, was sacred. Within marriage, and strictly for procreation, it was a holy act, a miniature reenactment of divine creation. The problem was, no one ever seemed to get it quite right. Or rather, the definition of right kept shifting. Different regions, different orders of monks, even different individual confessors interpreted the rules differently. Some were lenient, encouraging closeness between spouses. Others were strict to the point of absurdity, advising couples to sleep in separate beds except on fertile nights, approved by the calendar. And then there were the priors and bishops who went rogue. One eccentric 12th century bishop claimed that sex during thunderstorms invited demons into the marriage bed. Another warned that conceiving a child on a feast day would result in monstrous offspring. And while we laugh now, couples took these warnings seriously. Religious fear ran deep, especially when nearly every child, mortality, disease or bad harvest could be interpreted as divine punishment. So if a baby was born with a limp or a birthmark, people might whisper it was because the parents consummated their marriage on the wrong day. Not all church attitudes were uniform, though. There were debates even among theologians. Some argued that sexual pleasure was a gift from God, a way to strengthen the marital bond. Others insisted that it was a necessary evil, something to be endured, not enjoyed. One major debate centered around whether orgasm in women was necessary for conception. Early medieval medical theories, still half-rooted in ancient Greek ideas, claimed both partners had to reach climax for pregnancy to occur. That meant, oddly enough, some clergy encouraged husbands to ensure their wives' pleasure, not for romance, but for reproductive efficiency. There's a fringe belief, recorded in a few dusty theological treatises, that too much passion during sex could summon the devil. That's right. If you enjoyed it too much, Lucifer might be lounging invisibly at the foot of your bed, taking notes. That'll kill a mood fast. But despite all this control and commentary, real people, real couples, still found ways to make their wedding night mean something personal. They whispered to each other in the dark, they laughed nervously, they experimented cautiously, they pushed boundaries. Yes, many were terrified. Yes, some were traumatized. But some were lucky enough to find something tender in all the noise. And honestly, the church couldn't police everything. Behind closed doors, outside the walls of castles and cloisters, human nature was doing its thing. Even if you confessed every little detail, who's to say what really happened when the candles went out? Maybe you stuck to the rules, maybe you didn't. Maybe you held hands afterward. Maybe you lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what all the fuss was about. Either way, when dawn breaks, the church will still be there, ready with its calendars, its confessions, and its catalogue of do's and don'ts. You might get a pat on the back or a penance. But the truth? You're married now. You've crossed into the sacred, chaotic world of medieval matrimony, and you've got a long road ahead. But hey, at least no one's excommunicated you. Yet. You wake up the morning after, your limbs sore from sleeping on what basically felt like a lumpy sack of moss. And before your feet even hit the chilly stone floor, you're reminded this isn't just your bed anymore. It never really was. In the Middle Ages, the marriage bed isn't just a piece of furniture tucked away behind a curtain. It's practically a stage, a symbol, a bargaining chip. And sometimes, brace yourself, it's the community's bed too. Let's start with the literal. Beds were luxury items. Even among the wealthy, you didn't just have a spare one lying around. You shared. People slept together for warmth, security, and practicality. It wasn't unusual for a whole family to crash in the same sleeping area, or for servants to doze at the foot of their lord's bed. Privacy was, shall we say, aspirational. So when a couple married, they usually shared a room, and sometimes a bed, not just with each other, but with visiting relatives, curious friends, and the occasional snoring page boy. If you're a peasant, the concept of a private honeymoon suite is laughable. You probably live in a single-room hut where the livestock get better insulation than you do. So after the wedding, the couple might be nudged into a corner on a makeshift mattress surrounded by relatives who are either pretending to sleep or not even bothering to hide their eavesdropping. Not out of rudeness, necessarily. It's just how things were. Communal living meant communal everything, and that included bedding down. In some villages, it went even further. There's evidence, and especially from rural France and parts of Eastern Europe, that the community had an active role in seeing the couple off. Neighbours, family, sometimes even clergy would walk the couple to their shared bed and remain in the room for a bit to make sure everything was going, well, according to plan. The community's honour was at stake. A valid marriage meant social order remained intact. So yes, there are stories, eyebrow-raising ones, of people literally gathering around the bed like it was a performance, offering encouragement or awkward silence. And the bed itself? Oh, the bed mattered. Among the nobility, the wedding bed was a centrepiece of the household, often elaborately carved, draped in heavy curtains, and sometimes gifted as part of the bride's dowry. It might be passed down through generations, making your first night not only intimate but haunted by the knowledge that your parents and grandparents also did the deed in the exact same creaky oak frame. Così. Right? Beds were also mobile. Wealthy couples often brought their own bed with them when they travelled, like a personalised, splinter-prone version of today's hotel loyalty programme. In fact, some noble households kept multiple marriage beds ready to go, just in case of surprise unions, visiting relatives, or the occasional political crisis that ended in a hasty wedding. Now here's the weird bit. Marriage beds could be ceremonial too. There are accounts of beds being blessed by clergy, sprinkled with holy water, and surrounded by candles like a sacred altar. And in a way, that's exactly what it was. The marriage bed was the place where a union was cemented, not in ink or under the law, but through bodies, vows, and socially sanctioned intimacy. It wasn't just where you slept. It was where futures were created, heirs were born, alliances were secured, power shifted, and that made the bed everyone's business. Let's not forget the morning after tradition, the inspection. In many noble households, someone, usually an older female relative or a trusted servant, would retrieve the wedding sheets and check them for blood. If they found it, congratulations, the marriage was validated, the bride was declared pure, and the groom got a hearty slap on the back. If not, whispers started. Rumours spread. The couple might even be summoned for questioning. Sometimes the sheet itself was hung outside the window for the whole town to see, like a flag of victory or defeat. Now, this practice wasn't just about gossip. In some regions, it had legal implications. If a noble family could prove the bride wasn't a virgin, they might demand a refund on her dowry. That's right, her body was financially guaranteed. And if the groom claimed he couldn't consummate the marriage, whether from nerves, drunkenness, or disinterest, his family could seek an annulment or renegotiation. And the poor couple, who probably just wanted to be left alone, would find themselves dragged into court, or worse, into theological debate. There's also a strange tradition from parts of Scotland and Ireland where newlyweds were expected to sleep the first few nights with guests visiting their bed in shifts. Not to join in, thankfully, but to share the warmth and offer blessings. Picture your drunk uncle climbing into bed next to you, wishing you luck, and then promptly falling asleep while you're trying to process your first marriage experience. It happened more than once. And don't even think about locking the door. Most peasant homes didn't even have doors, and castles, those doors were for keeping out assassins, not in-laws. In noble courts, a servant might stand just outside the room, ready to fetch a midwife, deliver a message, or inform the priest if something went spiritually or physically wrong. One of the fringe facts historians still puzzle over involves marriage bed relics. Some monasteries preserved pieces of famous royal wedding beds as holy objects, believing the beds had absorbed something sacred through the consummation of noble bloodlines. There's one bizarre case from 13th century Italy, where a splinter from a royal bed was kept in a reliquary next to a saint's tooth. No, it doesn't make sense, but medieval logic didn't always follow ours. There's debate among scholars about how much these communal bed traditions actually impacted couples emotionally. Some argue that this hyper-public start to a marriage robbed intimacy of any real meaning, turning what should have been private into performance. Others suggest it forged bonds, albeit through shared trauma. After all, starting a life together under public scrutiny might push people closer, like soldiers in the same trench. But either way, your bed isn't just a mattress. It's politics, performance, and pressure. And as you try to settle in beside your new spouse, both of you exhausted, confused, maybe still a little drunk, you're not just hoping for sleep. You're hoping no one else climbs in tonight. Because in the Middle Ages, even your dreams have an audience. At this point, maybe you're starting to think the medieval wedding night was a one-and-done ordeal. A horrifying circus of blood-stained linens, gossipy servants, and sanctimonious whispers. But no, oh no, the real fun begins after that first night. Because in medieval Europe, sex doesn't just exist in the shadows of your marriage. It's choreographed by the stars, the saints, and your local priest's increasingly specific calendar. Welcome to the baffling, bureaucratic maze of when you're allowed to do it. Spoiler, most of the time you aren't. Let's start with the days of the week. Today people argue about which day is date night. In the Middle Ages, some days were literally forbidden for any bedroom activity. Tuesdays were widely considered unlucky, thought to be the day evil entered the world. Friday was out too, that was the day Christ died. And commemorating the crucifixion by getting frisky was considered borderline heretical. Sunday was God's day, so obviously that was a no-go. And Saturday? Well, depending on where you were, that might be okay, unless it was during a feast period, which, by the way, was most of the year. Now toss in Lent, Advent, and every holy day on the calendar. No sex during any of those either. Lent alone is 40 days. Advent, about 4 weeks. Then there are the days before feast days, the eves of saints' days, and random vigils where even looking lustfully at your spouse was considered spiritually dangerous. Add it all up and you're left with maybe 90 to 100 safe days a year. And even then, you'd better be doing it only for procreation. Enjoyment? That'll cost you 3 Hail Marys and a side of shame, and that's not even getting into seasonal rules. Spring was fertile, so it got a cautious green light. Especially during the full moon, which medieval folk believed helped with conception. But summer? Risky. Too hot. Could cause fevered passions. Autumn was generally acceptable, as long as you avoided harvest festivals. And winter? Cold, holy, and full of solemnity. Best to just cuddle under the sheepskins and dream of spring. Then there was astrology, because apparently the church calendar alone wasn't complicated enough. Many believed that the positions of the stars and planets could directly affect fertility, mood, and even the outcome of the act. Saturn in retrograde? Probably a bad idea. The moon in Virgo? That might bless your union or curse it, depending on who you asked. Some people wouldn't dare consummate a marriage without consulting a local astrologer or herbalist first. Because, of course, why not schedule your intimacy around the celestial bodies that already control your crops and your plagues? One odd detail. In some regions, it was considered bad luck to consummate a marriage during a thunderstorm. People believed that lightning could split a couple's spiritual unity, or worse, attract demonic attention if passion got too intense. So imagine the scene. You're finally alone and your guests are drunk and passed out, the candles are lit, and just as things start heating up, boom, thunder, cue prayers, cue sudden abstinence, cue complete mood kill, and yes, this applied even on your wedding night. The pressure to perform was intense, but so was the fear of sinning at the exact moment the church, the village, and your own eternal soul were watching. If your wedding day happened to fall during a forbidden season, or if a sudden shift in moon phase occurred, some couples were advised to wait. Sometimes days, sometimes weeks, which really just added another layer of anticipation to an already stressful ritual. Now, how did people keep track of all this? Enter the sin calendars. These were real things, handwritten guides that detailed which days were holy, which were clean, and which were absolutely off limits. Some included little symbols, like stars or crosses, marking the safe or forbidden zones. Think of it as the medieval version of a fertility tracker app, only way more judgmental and sponsored by fear of eternal damnation. And people actually followed them too, or tried to. Confessors would sometimes quiz married couples. When was your last act? Did you observe the fast? Did you avoid the feast of St. Gervasius, patron of unspoiled chastity? It wasn't just about timing. It was about purity, obedience, submitting not just your soul, but your body clock to the divine. That said, not everyone complied. There are always rebels. Some couples just rolled their eyes, pulled the curtains and did what they wanted, quietly. In towns and villages, you'd hear whispers about this family or that couple who couldn't keep their hands off each other, even during Holy Week. Some priests turned a blind eye, others didn't. There are actual records of couples doing penance for having sex on the wrong day, public penance in some cases, like walking barefoot to church or fasting for a week. Talk about a walk of shame, and yet despite all these restrictions, sex still happened. Babies still arrived. Marriages somehow functioned. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not romantically, but people adapted. Some couples kept mental tallies of safe nights. Others just went for it and hoped the saints weren't paying attention. And then there were those who tried to balance both, doing their duty and sneaking in a little pleasure where they could. Maybe a hand held under the blanket, a kiss on a forbidden Tuesday, a whispered joke about St. Agnes turning her holy back. Interestingly, there's still debate among historians about how rigid these rules actually were in everyday life. Some argue that sin calendars were more ideal than enforced, that the church set these rules as lofty goals, not as literal law. Others believe that for devout communities the rules were non-negotiable, and that breaking them led to real fear, guilt, and in extreme cases, community punishment. Like most things medieval, the truth probably falls somewhere in between, devout in public, flexible in private. But one thing's certain, sex in medieval marriage wasn't spontaneous. It was scheduled, scrutinised, and soaked in superstition. And your wedding night, supposedly the most natural moment between two people, was really just the beginning of a long, exhausting negotiation between desire and doctrine. So next time you feel frustrated about conflicting date nights or someone not being in the mood, just be glad you don't need to cross-reference the moon, the saints, the crop cycle, and your confession schedule before making a move. Medieval love, it came with paperwork. You've somehow made it through the night. The sheets have either told a tale or stirred suspicion, and now the sun is up and people are already starting to talk. Because in the Middle Ages, what happened under those linen covers didn't stay there. It marched out the front door, flapped on a clothesline, and occasionally made it all the way to the royal court. And no part of that spectacle was more legendary or more problematic than the so-called proof of virginity, or, to put it more bluntly, the bleeding sheet. Let's not sugarcoat this. Your new wife's anatomy is about to become everyone's favourite breakfast topic. Somewhere, someone is already peering at a crumpled piece of stained fabric with the solemnity of a courtroom judge, nodding along as if a few smudges of red can speak volumes about honour, morality and lineage. And yes, people are genuinely invested. Because this isn't just private drama, it's political capital. Among the nobility, that little smear of blood was a prize. It meant the bride was pure, the dowry was safe, and the marriage was unchallengeable. More than that, it was proof that any children born of this union would have a clean bloodline. You didn't want to raise someone else's heir. And you certainly didn't want to split your estate with a child who might have been fathered by some stable boy. In a world where family names and land ownership shaped everything, that little spot of red held a disturbing amount of power. Of course, the assumption behind all this, that a woman's first time must involve bleeding, is scientifically dicey. Hymens come in all shapes, sizes and levels of elasticity. Some women bleed, some don't, some tear long before sex thanks to riding horses, climbing trees or, existing. But medical knowledge at the time wasn't exactly grounded in biology. It was more like a grab bag of ancient Greek theory, religious panic and rumours whispered behind monastery walls. So, no blood. The consequences could range from raised eyebrows to annulments. The groom might claim he was deceived. The bride could be sent back to her family in shame, dowry revoked. In extreme cases, especially in very powerful families, the bride might face accusations of adultery, or worse. There's at least one infamous case in 14th century Aragon, where a noblewoman's non-bloody sheet triggered a 3-year legal war, complete with medical exams, rival testimonies and eventually exile. Over a bedsheet. Now, on the other hand, if there was blood, things could get weirdly celebratory. The sheet might be displayed, literally hung in a window or waved like a banner. Servants gossiped. Mothers-in-law wept with joy. Neighbours congratulated each other as if they'd been in the room helping. In some parts of England and France, the stained sheet was even kept for years, like a relic, sometimes folded carefully into a chest, sometimes brought out during family arguments as indisputable evidence of a virtuous start. And let's not forget the grotesque but real phenomenon of nobles using the sheet as proof of alliance. That's right, this little scrap of textile, possibly soaked in nervous sweat and bodily fluids, could be shown to political allies or rival families to prove the marriage was finalised. Imagine passing around a blood-stained napkin at a diplomatic meeting like, "Behold, our treaty is sealed." Not surprisingly, couples got creative. Some women faked it, cleverly, desperately, resourcefully. Pig's blood was a classic substitute. Animal bladders filled with dye, tucked into undergarments, sharp pricks to the thigh or hand just before entering the bed. Even crushed berries in a pinch. Anything to give the appearance of honour, especially if your body wasn't going to deliver the show on its own. And fun fact, this wasn't always the bride's idea. In some households, older women, servants, or even male relatives would suggest these tricks, because everyone had something riding on that proof. Families didn't just want their daughters to succeed, they needed them to. A bad wedding night could ripple out through alliances, inheritance lines, and even religious standings. You weren't just representing yourself, you were the front line in your family's war for survival and status. The church, meanwhile, had a complicated relationship with the whole virginity obsession. On one hand, it venerated chastity. Virgins, especially female ones, were considered spiritually superior. Saints, martyrs, literal brides of Christ. On the other hand, the church also wanted consummated marriages, because those led to babies, and babies meant baptized souls, which meant more tithing, more power, more influence. So while they didn't officially endorse waving bloody sheets around, they didn't exactly shut it down either. And then there's the fringe stuff. In some regions of Eastern Europe and the Middle East, there were specialists, yes, specialists, who were called in to verify a bride's virginity before marriage. These so-called examiners, often midwives or healers, would perform pre-wedding checks that were part medicine, part mythology. Their findings could make or break a deal, and if a woman failed the inspection, well, there were rituals, restorative herbal treatments, secret hymen repair techniques. Sometimes the family would simply go quiet and hope no one asked questions. Historians still argue over how widespread the sheet tradition really was. Some say it was mostly a noble obsession, dramatised for political purposes. Others argue it bled into every social class, just differently. Among peasants, the sheet might not be displayed, but word still travelled fast. A midwife, a neighbour, someone sleeping nearby. There was always someone ready to confirm or deny whether the act had been done properly. It's worth noting too that not all women were victims in this. Some leaned into the role, using their virginity as leverage. A well-placed rumour, a manipulated stain, a perfectly timed tearful performance, these could all buy a woman more power than she'd ever have otherwise. In a world where legal rights for women were practically non-existent, manipulating the marriage script was a survival tactic. Still, for most, it wasn't empowering, it was terrifying. Imagine being a teenage bride, freshly married to a man you barely know, your body bruised from unfamiliarity and nerves, and now there's an elderly aunt unrolling your sheets in front of a gaggle of whispering nobles. That kind of pressure doesn't fade overnight. It etches into your bones. And if the verdict is anything less than satisfactory, you might be branded with suspicion for the rest of your life. So yes, in the medieval world, the wedding night didn't end when the candles burned out or when the room emptied. It ended when the cloth was deemed worthy. And in that moment, you weren't just a person, you were a symbol. A body reduced to stains, surrounded by people eager to see whether you passed a test you never signed up for. And if you didn't, well, they had rituals for that too. By now, you're probably thinking, all right, maybe things were rough for the nobles, but surely here the peasants had it easier, right? Sort of. In truth, both ends of the medieval spectrum got the short end of the marital bedpost, just in different flavours. If you were a peasant, your wedding night was less about ritual and politics, and more about cramped spaces, cold floors, and trying not to be overheard by the livestock. But if you were a noble, your life was wrapped in brocade, but your bedroom still felt like a hostage negotiation with God, family, and 20 generations of expectations. So let's get cosy and compare the noble knights and peasant plights. Start with class. If you were born into nobility, your marriage was almost never your decision. You were a pawn, a token, a flesh and blood handshake between your father and some other father who wanted land, titles, or a more attractive connection to the royal family. Love? Compatibility? Irrelevant. You might not even speak the same language as your new spouse. Picture being a 15-year-old girl carted off across the continent to a stone castle where your new husband is 10 years older, smells like salted meat, and is barely literate. Surprise, you're soulmates now. Your wedding night as a noble might come with luxuries, feather beds, servants waiting with warm towels, silk robes embroidered with dragons or family crests. But don't be fooled. Those velvet curtains didn't soften the pressure. If you were a princess or duchess, you madame sauvage. Your entire future hinged on whether you could pop out an heir. One wrong move, no bleeding sheet, no pregnancy within a year, or too many daughters in a row, and you could be quietly replaced or loudly disgraced. If things went really badly, you might be packed off to a convent. And yes, the groom was under pressure too. He had to perform reliably and efficiently. If he didn't, the whole house of cards could collapse. Now swing the pendulum to the other end. If you're a peasant, you've got fewer titles, but also fewer eyes on your bedroom. You might not even have a wedding ceremony in the way nobles did. Sometimes it was just a public declaration, a clergyman muttering a prayer, and then boom, you're married. Done. But your wedding night? Probably happening in the same one-room hut where your siblings are asleep 10 feet away. Your goats are chewing hay in the corner, and your mother-in-law is pretending to snore. Not exactly mood lighting. Privacy? Nope. Clean sheets? Hilarious. But there was a kind of freedom in that simplicity. You weren't expected to bleed on cue. You weren't being groomed to secure a dynasty. Sure, the gossip mill still churned. Neighbours whispered about who did what, who didn't look pleased the next morning. But the stakes weren't quite so devastating. If you were a young peasant couple who genuinely liked each other, you had a shot at building something real, something forged more by shared struggle than inherited land. Still, don't romanticize the peasant life too much. Just because your marriage wasn't a diplomatic agreement doesn't mean it was easy. A lot of peasant unions were still arranged by families. Consent? It was more of a vibe than a requirement. If your father needed to merge fields with a neighbour or settle a debt, guess who got volunteered? And while you didn't have courtiers peeking in on your consummation, you did have a community eager to judge whether your wife looked appropriately used the next day. It was less about blood and more about behaviour. Was she walking funny? Was she quiet? Smiling? Blushing? The village had its own version of sheet staring. They just used faces instead of fabric. Economically, things were also starkly different. For nobles, marriage was expensive. The dress, the feast, the dowry, the public ritual, all of it was designed to show off wealth and power. The consummation wasn't just a personal act, it was a continuation of the display. There are cases of royal couples being formally escorted to the bedroom by dozens of guests, then tucked in while poetry was read aloud. In one royal court, the king himself helped draw the curtains, as if saying, "Best of luck, my liege. Make it count." Peasants, meanwhile, did what they could. A village wedding might involve dancing, beer, a roast chicken if they were lucky, and then, without so much as a hymn, the couple would head home. No trumpet fanfare, no holy bed blessing, just practical chaos. You might have to push a cousin off the bed before crawling in. You might have to wait until the coals went out and the firelight stopped flickering across your uncle's sleeping face. Romantic? In its own gritty way, sure. There's also a class difference in how problems were handled. If a noble couple failed to consummate the marriage, or if rumours started flying, it could result in a public inquiry. There were annulments, political manoeuvrings, and even church trials. Witnesses were called. Bedsheets were displayed in court. Servants testified under oath. One famous case involved a nobleman who claimed his wife was a witch, who bewitched his member into slumber. The church wasn't buying it, but they did allow a spiritual exorcism just in case. Peasants didn't have that kind of drama. If the wedding night flopped, no one was dragging you in front of a bishop. You were more likely to be the butt of a few tavern jokes, or have your mother quietly hand you a bouquet of herbs and suggest you try again when the moon was better aligned. And if things really didn't work out, people just moved on. Maybe you separated quietly. Maybe you stuck it out. Maybe you drank enough ale that you eventually figured it out. And let's be honest, people on both ends of the social scale weren't always marrying as virgins. That whole wait until marriage rule, more like a suggestion, especially among peasants. It wasn't uncommon for couples to sleep together before the wedding, sometimes for years. There were even things called handfastings, or trial marriages, where couples lived together before making things official. In some villages, pregnancy before the wedding was practically expected. It was like an engagement ring that kicked. That being said, for noble women, even a rumour of premarital sex could be ruinous. Entire fortunes could vanish. Inheritance claims could be challenged. A non-virgin noblewoman was considered damaged goods regardless of what actually happened. The double standard was real, sharp and merciless. So whether you were sleeping under a velvet canopy or a thatched roof, your wedding night carried weight. It marked a transition, from individual to partner, from youth to adulthood, from maybe hopeful to definitely accountable. The rituals, the expectations, the gossip, the pressure, it looked different depending on your status, but it shaped you just the same. In the end, whether you were covered in silk or straw, you weren't sleeping alone. You had the weight of your family, your community, and your own uncertain future tucked into that bed with you. And you hoped, quietly, desperately, that maybe tomorrow would come without a knock on the door or a summons to explain why the sheets weren't quite red enough. So here you are, married. Maybe you're still reeling from the awkward theatre of your wedding night, or maybe you're just trying to get used to the way your new spouse chews with their mouth open. Either way, reality sets in fast. Because in medieval Europe, a wedding wasn't a culmination, it was the start of a lifelong transaction. And that wedding night? It was only the first move in a deeply strategic game of alliances, property, civility, and, most awkwardly, strangers touching each other because their dads told them to. Welcome to the wonderful world of arranged marriages, where awkward silences stretch longer than the ceremony and the first person to fall in love loses. Let's get this straight. Most medieval marriages weren't about romance. Not even close. They were contracts, sometimes made when the bride and groom were still in swaddling clothes, that sweet-looking couple holding hands in the tapestry. They were probably betrothed before they could form complete sentences. Noble families would arrange a union years in advance, often negotiating like diplomats haggling over borders. Dowries were promised. Estates were merged. Bloodlines were debated. And no one involved particularly cared whether the couple liked each other, just that the math added up. So imagine it. You're a 14-year-old girl, just finished learning how to curtsy, maybe still giggling at the kitchen boy, and suddenly you're being shipped off to a remote castle to marry a guy you've never seen before. His portrait arrived a few months ago, painted by someone who clearly believed flattery was a holy duty. He has nice cheekbones in the image. In real life, he's got a lazy eye, a bad temper, and a laugh that sounds like a wounded goose. But congratulations, he's yours now. The wedding might happen that same week. There's no waiting, no engagement dinners, no slow progression from flirtation to affection. It's whiplash. 1 minute you're riding in a cart surrounded by trunks and itchy dresses, and the next you're saying vows in Latin, beside a man whose first words to you are, "You're shorter than I expected." The only thing more disorienting than the ceremony is the realization that tonight you're supposed to undress for this stranger, and he for you. Now flip the perspective. Maybe you're the groom. Your father tells you at breakfast that your bride will be arriving by sunset. You barely look up from your soup. Marriage is expected, necessary, preferable to the chaos that would ensue if your family didn't lock down this alliance with Lord Whoever's daughter. Maybe she's pretty. Maybe she's not. Maybe she speaks your language. Doesn't matter. You're expected to consummate the marriage, produce heirs, and carry on as if this were all perfectly normal, And in your world it is. The awkwardness is thick. You might have nothing in common, different customs, different dialects, maybe even different religions depending on where your families hail from. There are records of noble couples who required translators on their still wedding night. Not exactly a mood booster. And yes, sex still had to happen, or at least be convincingly simulated, because the contract wasn't valid without it. Some couples didn't even live in the same household after marrying. If they were too young, or the political situation was tense, they might be separated again, sometimes for years, until it was safe for them to resume married life. Others were sent off to live in distant estates away from court intrigue. In some cases, they didn't reunite until it was time to produce an heir. The honeymoon concept? Not a thing. You were lucky to get a hot meal and a bed that didn't already have someone else's name carved into the headboard. Still, not all arranged marriages were disasters. Occasionally, two people met, married, and, despite the odds, genuinely liked each other. Maybe affection grew from shared duty or mutual respect. Maybe the bride knew how to play chess. Maybe the groom knew how to listen. Love, when it did come, was slow-burning, tender, unexpected. Not the fireworks of romance novels, but the slow stitching of trust over time. But make no mistake, it wasn't the goal. It was a pleasant side effect, like discovering your castle has decent plumbing. But what if it didn't work? What if the wedding night was a catastrophe and things didn't improve from there? Well, good luck. Annulments were difficult, expensive, and shameful. They required legal manoeuvring and ecclesiastical approval. One of the few accepted reasons for annulment, non-consummation. But to prove that, you needed witnesses, confessions, and often humiliating examinations. If the bride said the marriage hadn't been consummated, the husband had to either prove her wrong or admit to impotence. Either option was mortifying. There are open debates among historians about how strictly these marital expectations were enforced. Some say the upper class was watched closely, with wedding nights practically notarized. Others suggest the church and court turned the blind eye, unless property or power was at stake. Among the middle and lower classes, enforcement was looser, but expectations remained. If you didn't sleep with your spouse, the marriage was spiritually and legally incomplete, which meant rumours, and rumours meant trouble. And not every arranged marriage involved just two people. Sometimes entire families cohabitated. That's right, your mother-in-law might move in, your siblings, your new spouse's wet nurse, one big tangled network of inherited obligations and intrusive opinions. And in this setting, your wedding night was never really over. Every breakfast, every glance, every babyless month was quietly measured for signs that the marriage was progressing as expected. If it wasn't, there were always whispers, and occasionally intervention. Yet despite all this, arranged marriages persisted because they worked. For the system. They held up dynasties. They kept land in the family. They prevented war, cemented alliances, and made sure that social order kept humming along. And sure, they crushed a few souls along the way, but no one in power seemed too bothered by that. So you lie in bed beside your new spouse, whom you still don't quite recognise in the daylight, and you wonder what comes next. Maybe it's a life of awkward silences and polite nods. Maybe one day you'll laugh about the horrors of your first night. Maybe you'll raise children and never quite speak of the way your marriage began. Or maybe you'll find ways to care for each other, in spite of the system that forced you together. Either way, the marriage is done, the vows are sealed, and your life, for better or worse, now includes someone who was once a stranger and is now your daily mirror, reflecting every choice, every duty, and every awkward beginning that brought you here. Let's rewind a little, not to the wedding, but to what came before. Because while the church loved to pretend every marriage began with pure intentions and perfectly chaste courtship, reality was far messier. In fact, behind the tapestries and under the haylofts, there existed an entire unofficial system of try-before-you-buy relationships. Yep, we're talking about premarital sex in medieval Europe. And the thing no one wants to admit? It was happening. A lot more than you'd think. In many regions, especially among peasants and townsfolk, there was this thing called hand-fasting. It wasn't some vague betrothal. It was a full-on, we're together now and probably going to be married, so let's go ahead and act like it kind of deal. Think of it as the medieval version of moving in together, minus the IKEA furniture and passive-aggressive texts. Hand-fasted couples were seen by their communities as unofficially, but still functionally married. And yes, that included sex, plenty of it. And the church, well, it was deeply uncomfortable with this. Theologians wrote heated letters about fornication and sinful unions, but they also knew something awkward. In a lot of cases, hand-fasting worked. Couples lived together, had children and built homes. They'd marry eventually, usually once they could afford the formal ceremony or the priest finally made his way to their village. Some even argued that if a couple said vows in front of witnesses, even without a priest, it counted as a valid marriage under canon law. The problem was proving it later. This blurry space between just fooling around and basically married caused endless legal headaches. If a man hand-fasted a woman, slept with her, and then ditched her to marry someone richer, she could CEO him. No, really. There are court records full of heartbroken or enraged women dragging their exes to church courts, clutching onto verbal promises and dirty laundry as evidence. And sometimes the court sided with them. He promised to marry me was, at least occasionally, enough to get that man legally bound to his former lover. But not always. And women bore the brunt of this ambiguous system. A noble woman might be ruined by the suggestion of premarital sex. A peasant woman could end up pregnant, unmarried, and completely at the mercy of her family's tolerance. If a man denied paternity, good luck. DNA tests were several centuries away, and all a woman had was her word, and sometimes a belly that proved the point. Interestingly, despite all the official hand-wringing, premarital sex wasn't always punished. In some villages, it was expected. A couple was supposed to test their compatibility, especially if children were the main goal of marriage, which, let's be honest, they usually were. Pregnancy before marriage wasn't necessarily scandalous, it was practical. In fact, in parts of Germany and Scandinavia, a woman who gave birth shortly after the wedding was celebrated, not shamed. People would wink and say, they're efficient. Others just shrugged. Life was hard, babies were helpful, who cared how they got there? But of course this leniency didn't apply to everyone. For noble women, purity was non-negotiable. A highborn girl caught in premarital scandal risked not just disgrace but disinheritance or forced exile to a convent. Her reputation was her family's reputation. If she Sillispelt, it wasn't just her future that burned, it was the whole house. Men were judged less harshly because of course they were. A nobleman with a string of pre-wedding flings was spirited. A noble woman, ruined. The double standard was ancient, blatant and ruthlessly enforced. Now, here's a quirky twist. Brothels were legal in many medieval cities. You heard that right. Cities like Paris, London and Florence had licensed, tax-paying brothels where unmarried men, especially apprentices, students and soldiers, were expected to sow their oats before marriage. Some municipal governments even regulated these establishments, enforcing dress codes for workers and setting limits on behaviour. The church, while officially disapproving, often turned a blind eye. Better to have a sin outlet than risk men taking out their urges on innocent maidens, or worse, nuns. There's one particularly strange case from 15th century Zurich, where a city council defended its local brothel by claiming it kept good women safe. The logic was twisted but revealing. People knew men had needs, and rather than pretend abstinence was universal, they created safe-ish spaces for those needs to be managed. Just, not with anyone of high social standing. Still, even within this tangle of sanctioned sin and cultural contradiction, many couples navigated love on their own terms. They sneaked away from feasts, they met in barns and shadowed corners of castles, they shared whispered promises and the occasional illicit touch under a tapestry. They fell in love, messily, quietly, sometimes permanently, because no matter how many rules the church issued, or how tightly fathers tried to control their daughters, people kept finding each other. And sometimes those pre-wedding relationships led to something real. A man might petition to marry a woman of lower status because, scandalously, he had fallen for her. A nobleman might try to legitimize a child born out of wedlock. A couple might elope. Yes, eloping was a thing, and risk the wrath of their families because they wanted to choose each other. Those stories are rarer, but they're there, buried between the dusty laws and confessionals. There's still scholarly debate about how common premarital sex really was. Some argue it was widespread and quietly tolerated, especially in rural areas. Others claim the church's pressure created genuine restraint, and most people did wait. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, a spectrum of experiences shaped by class, culture, geography and luck. So while your wedding night might have been your first official encounter, it wasn't always your first encounter. The church wanted it to be. The ideal was virginal awkwardness and spiritual trembling. But the world had other ideas, and sometimes those ideas came with hay in your hair and a promise whispered in the dark. So let's talk about this so-called first time. The big moment, the deflowering, the sacred storybook mystical moment that centuries of poems, legends, and increasingly strange metaphors have insisted should be dramatic, unforgettable, and, let's face it, bloody. Because if medieval culture loved anything more than sin and salvation, it was the persistent myth that losing one's virginity was a universally painful, tear-soaked, scream-in-a-pillow kind of event, especially for women. But like most things in medieval lore, the reality was a lot more complicated and a lot less cinematic. First off, let's clear something up. The concept of deflowering as a clear, one-time physical transformation, that's not how anatomy works. Even today, a surprising number of people carry around the idea that the hymen is some kind of skin seal, like a freshness tab on a jar of jam, and that once it's broken, a woman is no longer a virgin. Back then, multiply that confusion by about 1,000 and add in a hefty layer of religious guilt, herbal guesswork, and advice from Aunt Hysterica, who once saw a goat give birth and now thinks she's an expert. Medieval physicians, if we can call them that, believed in a version of the body steeped in ancient Greek humoral theory. Women were thought to be cold and moist, men hot and dry. Together they made a balanced stew. Romantic, right? Virginity, they believed, was not just physical but spiritual, a kind of seal on the soul. Breaking it, especially during marriage, was a sacred and borderline traumatic act. The moment of penetration was supposed to represent the woman's transition from girlhood to womanhood, marked by blood, tears, and a lot of grimacing. A successful deflowering? One with blood, preferably enough to stain the sheets, ideally in front of witnesses, just to be safe. But here's the thing. Some women didn't bleed, ever. And some bled too much. And some faked it. And some had no idea what was even supposed to happen, because sex education was not exactly part of the medieval curriculum. If you were a noble woman, maybe your mother whispered something vague the night before, like, "Let him do what he must and offer no complaint." If you were a peasant girl, maybe you got a few rumours from your older sister, half laced with superstition and full of nervous giggles. And if you were a guy, you were expected to just know. Instinct, baby. No pressure. The expectation for blood became such an obsession that it created a whole genre of humiliating traditions. Midwives were sometimes called in after the wedding night to examine the bride. Older women were sent into the bedchamber to retrieve the sheets. Some families literally passed the cloth around like a war trophy. "Here lies the honour of our house," one proud nobleman reportedly declared, holding up his daughter-in-law's stained bed linen at breakfast. Imagine being the bride in that moment. Not exactly the dreamy, candle-lit memory you hoped for. And if there was no blood, chaos. The bride might be accused of impurity. The marriage might be challenged. The husband could claim he was tricked, that the woman was used goods, and try to have the union annulled. Sometimes he succeeded. Sometimes the woman was forced to publicly defend her virginity, which, think about that phrase for a moment. How exactly does one prove that? Which brings us to the fringe facts. The strange, unsettling, and downright bizarre lengths some women went to in order to fake the expected blood. Pig's blood was a favourite. A little pouch tucked into the undergarments, torn at the right moment. Crushed berries smeared in the right spot. A tiny self-inflicted wound on the thigh. One Spanish bride even used a red-dyed cloth she smuggled in during the bedding ceremony, timed her toss perfectly when the lights went low, and let her new husband take the credit. Applause all around. Some say these stories are exaggerated, romanticised, or just plain apocryphal. And sure, not every bride pulled a stunt like this. But the fact that these tactics existed at all says a lot about the pressures women faced. The idea that a woman's worth, morality, and family's reputation all hinged on a single moment, and that her body had to perform the right outcome like a one-night-only theatre production, was crushing, terrifying, and wildly unfair. Men didn't have it that easy either. While they weren't expected to bleed, they were expected to know what they were doing and get results fast. If the bride was pregnant within a few weeks, cheers, success, virility proven. If not, whispered doubts. Was he incapable? Had he failed to properly consummate the marriage? Was he bewitched? Yes, impotence was sometimes blamed on witchcraft. More on that in a later section, don't worry. One open scholarly debate surrounds just how universal the blood expectation really was. Some argue it was largely a noble obsession tied to property and inheritance. Among peasants who were too busy surviving to worry about virginity politics, maybe it wasn't such a big deal. Others argue the myth trickled down into all levels of society, embedded in folklore and local gossip. In some regions, a bride who didn't bleed was labelled a bad omen, supposedly foretelling poor crops or dying livestock. No pressure indeed. Of course, not all first nights were traumatic. Some were tender, some were hilariously awkward. There are love letters from the later Middle Ages that suggest genuine affection between spouses, even some who recall their first night fondly. And there were, believe it or not, a few bits of medieval advice literature that suggested husbands be gentle and patient with their wives on the wedding night. One 13th century French text, written for noblemen, advised that love may bloom if you treat her kindly and listen, a rare gem in a sea of get it over with and pray for forgiveness. Still, the damage of the deflowering myth persisted for centuries. It turned intimacy into evidence, love into legislation, and anatomy into accusation. For many, their first experience of sex wasn't about discovery, it was about passing a test they didn't agree to take. So if you're lying there on your wedding night, heart pounding, skin still stinging from nerves, and someone's waiting outside to see if you passed the great invisible exam, know this, it's not your fault. The expectations were never about you, they were about systems, power, control, and a collective inability to accept that human bodies, like human hearts, don't always behave the way people want them to. So now that we've trudged through the blood-stained linens and soul-crushing expectations, let's take a breath and wander down a stranger path, the one lined with fragrant herbs, suspicious powders, and whispered incantations under the full moon. Because let's be honest, when you're faced with a wedding night full of pressure, fear, and an unfamiliar body, sometimes you don't pray, you brew. Welcome to the bizarre, fragrant, and occasionally toxic world of medieval love potions and lust charms. It's late, the fire is low, you're staring at your new spouse, someone who looks as nervous as you feel, and you're both wondering, how does this even start? If you were lucky and brave, you might have gotten some whispered advice from a friend, a nursemaid, or the village herbalist. But for many, the answer to a shaky libido wasn't talking, it was tinkering. With roots, with powders, with that vial of something your grandmother swore would make any man stand tall like a proud knight. Yes, aphrodisiacs were a thing, and people took them seriously. Let's start with herbs. Some were relatively benign. Dill, fennel, and cinnamon were thought to stir the blood. Ginger, especially, was a favourite for its warming properties, good for digestion, and according to one French guidebook, for arousing heat in the lower belly. Honey infused with pepper or saffron was another classic. It wasn't just about taste, it was believed to stimulate the body, to soften resistance, or to ignite desire. Think of it as pre-game potion prep. Other concoctions were more adventurous. There's evidence that people crushed up mandrake root, an herb with strong hallucinogenic and narcotic effects, and brewed it into wine. Mandrake was shaped vaguely like a human, which was enough for people to believe it could enhance human passion. It was so potent, though, that too much could knock you out, or worse. And then there was Spanish fly, made from powdered blister beetles. Highly toxic, occasionally fatal, and yet people still used it, desperate to spark lust, or at least wake the groom up. You didn't even have to drink something. Some spells involved rubbing a mix of herbs and animal fats onto your thighs or neck. Others called for charms sewn into your nightgown, little bags of dried rose petals, mint and rosemary tied with red thread. There were even specific stones that, when worn against the skin of so, were said to inspire desire or increase virility. Garnets, for example, were believed to stir passion. Onyx, not so much. It was thought to cause melancholy, so best leave that one off your wedding night ensemble. But what if the problem wasn't physical? What if it was emotional or spiritual? That's when you might turn to a local wise woman. You know the type, the one with too many cats, a garden full of nettles, and the uncanny ability to know things she shouldn't. You'd go to her in secret, ask her for something to make your husband love you, or at least not recoil, and she'd nod, mutter something about moon phases, and hand you a little pouch. Maybe it worked. Maybe it didn't. Maybe it just gave you the confidence to face the night. Love magic in the Middle Ages walked a thin line. The church hated it, of course. Love potions and erotic charms were seen as dangerously close to witchcraft. And if something went too well, if a couple was too passionate or too eager, people might raise eyebrows. Was it natural, or had someone been tampering? There were actual court cases where men accused their wives of bewitching them into lust. One poor soul in 14th century Italy swore that every time he saw his wife his body betrayed him, and that she had once sprinkled something suspicious in his wine. She denied it, but the town didn't forget. Still, plenty of people, especially women, resorted to love magic as a survival tactic. In a world where marriages were arranged, feelings were irrelevant, and obedience was expected, having a secret advantage in the bedroom could be the only form of control they had. One popular method involved writing the initials of the desired person on a piece of parchment, wrapping it in red silk and hiding it under the mattress. Another involved mixing menstrual blood into food or drink, yes, seriously, as a binding charm. It was risky, revolting to some, but deeply believed by many. And not all love potions were about making the night start. Some were about making it end. If you didn't want to be touched, if your new husband was cruel, or if you were just exhausted, there were herbs for that too: rue, tansy, pennyroyal. These were abortifacients, but also thought to dampen libido. A little dose in his wine and maybe he'd fall asleep instead of reaching for your leg. Dangerous? Yes. But then again, so was being forced to perform on command, night after night, with no say and no reprieve. There's still scholarly debate about how widely these practices were used. Some argue that love potions were more common in folklore than in actual households, that most people didn't dabble in herbs and magic unless they were desperate. Others point to trial records, herbals and domestic guides that mention these concoctions openly, suggesting they were a part of everyday life. Quietly passed from grandmother to granddaughter like a family recipe you only use when truly needed. And then, of course, there were the professional love magicians, travelling alchemists and peddlers who sold powders, perfumes and oils, guaranteed to stir the soul and lower the loins. You'd find them at festivals, outside churches, and sometimes in back alleys. Their products came with dramatic claims: one drop and he'll never stray, or rub this under your tongue to make her weep with desire. Half snake oil, half placebo, but maybe, just maybe, it gave people the courage to walk into that bedroom and give it a go. So here you are, tucked under the covers with a little pouch of cinnamon in your bodice and a suspiciously strong wine warming your stomach. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. Maybe the only magic in the room is that two terrified humans are trying, in all their nervous, tangled awkwardness, to meet each other halfway. Because in a world where love was rarely guaranteed, and even basic consent wasn't assured, sometimes a spoonful of honey and a hopeful heart were the strongest spells of all. So let's say the fire's gone out, the wine's dried up, the hopeful herbs have either worked their subtle magic or sat useless in your bodice, and now morning has arrived. You've survived the first night, bruised or blessed, but don't breathe easy just yet, because this next part is not exactly about romance. It's about proof, legal proof. In the medieval world, consummation wasn't just the symbolic cherry on top of a wedding, it was the defining ingredient. Without it, the whole thing might not count. That's right. If you didn't do the deed, your marriage was basically a handshake. You wake up as someone's spouse, but only technically. The church, and by extension the law, considered a marriage valid only if it was consummated. And consummation didn't mean cuddling aggressively or sharing a bowl of stew in front of the hearth. It meant exactly what you think it meant. Insert tab A into slot B. Successfully, willingly, ideally. And if it didn't happen, that wasn't just awkward, it was grounds for annulment. This wasn't just a theological rule, it had real-world consequences. Land rights, inheritance, political alliances. You couldn't have a half marriage and expect to carry on like nothing happened. If you wanted your new name to stick, your children to be legitimate, and your dowry to stay where it belonged, you had to follow through. The church's logic? If the union hadn't been physically sealed, then spiritually and legally, it was still unglued. Now, what counted as consummation? Technically, just one successful act. You didn't have to enjoy it, though nobody would complain if you did. You didn't have to repeat it, though let's be real, people hoped you would. But if there was no penetration, then your vows weren't finished. And here's where things get uncomfortable. Because how exactly did people prove consummation? Well, in the best case, the couple quietly got on with it and told no one. That was enough. Most of the time, no one pressed the issue unless there was a dispute. But if something did go wrong, If one party later claimed the marriage was never truly valid, it came down to evidence. And if you think things got personal before, buckle up. Say a bride wanted out of her marriage. Maybe she was miserable. Maybe the groom was impotent. Maybe he simply refused to touch her. If she went to church court and claimed the marriage was unconsummated, the judge wouldn't just shrug and say, "Sorry to hear that." No, there'd be an inquiry, witnesses called, possibly a physical examination. The court might ask the groom to prove his ability in a deeply humiliating and disturbingly public way. There's a real case from 14th century France where a nobleman was accused of being unable to consummate his marriage. He denied it. The church ordered a group of men, including 2 doctors and a priest, to observe him attempt to arouse himself. This took place in a cloister with the curtains. When nothing happened, they poked and prodded him like a reluctant pastry. Still nothing. He claimed it was stress. The court was unconvinced. Marriage annulled, family dishonoured. It was a mess. And it wasn't just men on trial. Women could be examined too, often by midwives or matrons appointed by the court. Their findings would be recorded in detail, sometimes disturbingly so, and presented as testimony. Whether or not penetration had occurred could be argued endlessly. One poor woman had to endure her husband describing in court how she clenched her thighs together like a smith's vice. The judges debated. Ultimately, they ruled in her favour. He was the problem, which was rare but not unheard of. Sometimes the bride and groom were simply ordered to go off for a second attempt, with a few witnesses nearby just to make sure. And if that sounds horrifyingly intrusive, it absolutely was. Some couples had to perform what was delicately called a tentamen, which was a supervised trial consummation. That's right, legally sanctioned marital coitus, with priests outside the door waiting for results. Think of it as the worst honeymoon encore imaginable. The legal distinction between consummated and unconsummated marriages created all kinds of opportunities. For escape, for manipulation, for revenge. If a woman wanted out of a marriage and could claim that it had never been consummated, she had a shot at freedom. If a man regretted his bride and claimed she'd resisted or physically blocked him, he might also be granted an annulment. And let's not forget those with powerful families pulling strings behind the scenes. A claim of non-consummation could cancel a political union faster than you could say breach of contract. Now, of course, people lied. All the time. Consummation was notoriously difficult to prove unless someone had been there, watching. And even then, who could say what really happened under the covers? There are reports of couples bribing servants to back up a false claim. Others simply made tearful declarations in court and hoped the bishops believed them. One famous case involved a man who claimed he thought he had consummated the marriage but later realised he might have dreamed it. The court didn't buy it. But not all cases were about escape. Some were about validation. If a marriage was being challenged, say, a rival family claimed it wasn't legal because it hadn't been properly sealed, the couple might be forced to prove consummation had occurred. That could mean parading witnesses, showing a bloody sheet, yes, again, or swearing oaths before the altar. A few even performed symbolic consummation in court, clasping hands, exchanging a kiss, declaring their union was of flesh as well as spirit. Medieval marriage law was weirdly theatrical that way. Scholars still debate how widespread these practices were. Some argue that most couples were left alone unless a major dispute arose. Others suggest that legal scrutiny was far more common than we'd like to imagine, especially in noble households where every inheritance was a potential landmine. What's clear is that consummation wasn't just a personal moment, it was legal evidence, and in the eyes of the church, if it didn't happen, you weren't really married. Period. So as you sit across from your spouse the morning after, rubbing your temple, hoping no one brings up the bed linens, you're also aware that your marriage exists in a strange, half-real state. It's both done and not done, spoken and still silent. The ceremony is finished, but the contract only becomes binding once your bodies have made it so. And that turns what should be a private, intimate moment into something uncomfortably public. Your love life, or lack thereof, is now a matter of legal record, or will be if anyone decides to ask. Let's say the wedding night has officially been declared successful. There was just enough noise, just enough blood, and perhaps a well-timed cheer from your best man outside the door. You're feeling like maybe, things will calm down now. You've done your part. Time to finally get some privacy, right? Oh no, not even close. Because the Middle Ages weren't exactly known for their respect of personal boundaries. and your newly consummated marriage is still everybody's business. So go ahead and try to settle in for a romantic night too, and get ready to be interrupted. Enter the chaperone with the candle. Imagine this. You're lying there halfway to sleep, the itchy wool blanket pressed to your chin, and suddenly, knock knock. Or more likely, no knock. The door creaks open, and in walks your mother-in-law. Or the priest. Or your elderly aunt holding a tallow candle and looking smug. Maybe she mumbles a blessing. Maybe she just looks. Sometimes she even touches the bed, checking for warmth. Why? Because part of her job is making sure you're not just roommates now. Your marriage is under observation. The post-wedding chaperone wasn't always official, but in many households, especially noble ones, someone was tasked with making sure you stayed on the right path. Right, in this case meaning frequent church-approved marital relations. And by tasked, we mean they volunteered. Oh, they lived for it. Mothers, wet nurses, old retainers, priests with a penchant for nosiness. Someone always wanted to peek behind the curtain and make sure things were going according to plan. It wasn't always intrusive. Sometimes the visits were framed as caretaking. You've just gone through a major life transition after all. The older women of the house might check in on the bride, offer herbal tea, ask pointed questions about how things are progressing. But make no mistake, this wasn't just maternal concern, it was a subtle investigation. Did you do it? Was it done well? And was there any sign you weren't planning to keep doing it on the regular? And heaven help you if someone thought you were hesitating. The church expected newlyweds to behave a certain way, diligently, modestly, and above all, productively. Sexual activity within marriage wasn't just encouraged, it was expected, as long as it was done properly, which is to say missionary, quiet, and focused on baby making. So these little check-ins were more than gossip. They were moral audits. A couple not sleeping together raised spiritual red flags. Were they denying each other? Were they tempted by outside lusts? Or worst of all, were they abstaining for pleasure? Lighting played a role in this theatre of propriety. Candles were a luxury, yes, but they were also symbolic. A single flame might be left burning in the marital chamber, even after the doors were shut, as a reminder that someone was always watching. Some households had servants come in to light or relight the candles each evening, lingering just long enough to accidentally catch a glimpse. In wealthier homes, it wasn't uncommon for torch-bearing pages to escort the couple back to bed after dinner, as though they'd wander off otherwise. And yes, there were stories, too many really, of chaperones who stayed in the room, not silently either. They'd pretend to sleep, snore conspicuously, or clear their throat at key moments. Some made conversation until they were sure things were underway. Don't mind me, just making sure no demons sneak in under the bed. Cosy. If that sounds mortifying, you're not wrong. For couples who barely knew each other, this kind of supervised intimacy turned something already awkward into full-blown anxiety. And for women in particular, it added on another layer of pressure. Not only were they expected to endure or even perform pleasure, but they were also judged on how fast they settled into the role of obedient wife. If she was shy, nervous, or, God forbid, resistant, someone would notice, and they'd talk. In some noble courts, these observations were formalised. A small group, usually older women or clergy, might be appointed to oversee the couple's first days together. This included checking for physical signs, of course, but also monitoring behaviour. Was the bride still sleeping alone? Did the groom go hunting at odd hours? Was the couple attending mass together in the morning, walking hand in hand like proper, pious newlyweds? Failure to act the part could have consequences. A young bride might be scolded, told she wasn't doing her duty. A groom might be warned about his spiritual responsibilities. And if the rumours persisted, if whispers of a cold bed turned into public knowledge, the marriage could be reviewed. Not annulled necessarily, but quietly questioned. The family might be pressured to intervene. It's worth noting that some couples fought back. There are letters and court records of spouses complaining furiously about the lack of privacy. One nobleman demanded that his father-in-law's servants be banned from his chamber, saying he'd had more freedom in the Crusades. Another bride wrote in her diary that she wished she'd stayed at the convent, where at least no one expected her to perform like a horse at market. And yet the presence of chaperones and observers persisted for centuries. Why? Because marriage wasn't a private contract. It was a community event, a social share, a spiritual undersing. And no matter how intimate it felt in the moment, it was still considered everyone's business. There's ongoing debate among historians about how common these literal chaperone intrusions were. Some argue they were reserved for nobility, where alliances mattered more and families had the staff to indulge in such theatrics. Others suggest that even in modest homes, someone, mother, sister, neighbour, found a way to linger, just in case. A nosy habit more than a formal policy. But even if you weren't literally being watched, the threat of being watched shaped behaviour. Couples weren't just learning each other's rhythms, they were learning how to perform their new roles. A dutiful smile in public, a carefully timed exit from dinner, a visible return to the same bed. Everything was part of the script, and the stage lights never really dimmed. So if you're lying there in the flickering glow of someone else's candle, clutching a sheet that still smells faintly of rosewater and old judgment, just know you're not alone. Not spiritually, not socially, and definitely not physically. In medieval marriage, privacy wasn't a right, it was a rumour. Let's say your new life as a married couple is now rolling along, if a little creakily. You've got nosy relatives, expectant servants, and the omnipresent stare of the church bearing down on your shared bed like a sack of bricks. But tonight, something's off. The candles are lit, the room smells faintly of lavender and tallow, but your spouse is sobbing, shivering, or maybe not even conscious. Or worse, they're not much older than a child, because now we need to talk about one of the darkest, most disturbing truths about medieval wedding nights. Sometimes they happened way too soon, to people far too young, and sometimes they weren't entirely consensual. Let's start with age. We've romanticised the Middle Ages to the point where we think young just meant like 16 with good posture, but in reality girls as young as 12 or even younger could legally be married. Boys slightly older depending on the region. Canon law said a girl could marry at 12, a boy at 14, as long as they gave consent. Yes, consent. A word that gets tossed around with tragic optimism in the records, but whose meaning in medieval context might just mean someone nodding, while surrounded by elders holding contracts. Now, in many noble families, marrying young was more about betrothal than immediate consummation. The wedding would happen for political or financial reasons, but the marriage wouldn't be consummated until the girl reached puberty, or whatever passed for it in the eyes of her family. But waiting wasn't always practiced. There are horror stories of girls, children really, being taken to the bridal chamber the same day they said their vows, handed over to a man twice or 3 times their age and told, "Be good." And everyone else went back to the feast. If that sounds cruel, it was, and terrifying, and sometimes fatal. There are recorded cases of young brides dying on their wedding night from injuries caused by forced consummation. Chroniclers rarely describe these events with any sensitivity. Often they just note that the bride took ill and passed shortly after marriage, which was a sanitised way of saying we broke her body and blamed her frailty. And it wasn't just the ages that made things grim, there was also alcohol. Weddings were raucous affairs. Ale, mead and wine flowed freely, even among the younger guests. It wasn't unusual for the groom, or bride, to enter the wedding night stumbling drunk. In some traditions, guests actively encouraged it, cheering them on, handing them yet another goblet. The assumption was that the buzz would make the bedding easier, maybe even take the edge off the fear, but intoxication and pressure made for a deeply dangerous combination. The word consent, in any modern sense, didn't really exist in this space. A noble woman might be told that duty to her family came first. A peasant girl might be warned not to anger the gods, or her father, by resisting. Some brides tried to flee, others refused to undress. There are tales of women scratching their own arms bloody, weeping through the ceremony, begging to be spared. The responses range from gently coaxing to outright coercion. "You'll understand when you're older," someone would say, only older was supposed to be that very night. And if it wasn't fear or youth preventing consummation, sometimes it was simple disgust or incompatibility. Couples who didn't like each other, didn't trust each other, or had been forced together under threat of ruin or violence might find themselves in bed as 2 cold statues. Some refused each other outright, and that refusal legally was a big deal. A marriage not consummated could be annulled, but that also meant pressure to fix the problem, often with witnesses involved, as we've covered. The more one spouse resisted, the harder the family pushed. Everyone's reputation was at stake, and the bride or groom's comfort ranked somewhere below the family pig. One fringe practice that should send a chill down your spine? Substituted bedding. In rare but real instances, If a noble groom was too shy, too drunk, or too uninterested to consummate his marriage, a servant might be brought in, with or without the bride's knowledge. The goal was to get the blood, the sheet, the proof, and then get out. Did this always happen? No. Was it a whispered tactic in some circles? Unfortunately, yes. There's at least one record of a lady-in-waiting who confessed years later to being sent in place of her mistresses to seal a noble union when the actual bride collapsed in terror. Meanwhile, if the groom was unable, or unwilling, the consequences could fall hard. He might be accused of impetence, a devastating charge in a culture that tied manhood directly to virility. There are stories of brides reporting that their husbands failed in the moment, only to be confronted with public trials, humiliating medical exams, or, in desperate cases, rituals involving potency prayers and freezing river baths. Because nothing screams romance like being dunked in an icy stream to wake up your desire. And in extreme cases, the marriage didn't just go badly, it became abusive. A spouse, especially a wife, had few options for recourse. If her husband forced himself on her, it wasn't considered rape. He had a right to her body. She was his wife. Her consent wasn't even a legal concept, it was assumed. There were church figures who cautioned husbands to be gentle, but these were moral suggestions, not enforceable laws. If a woman complained, she was often told to pray, or to be grateful that her husband found her desirable at all. Historians are still torn about how common these worst-case scenarios were. Some argue they were exceptional, not the norm, that most couples, even arranged ones, found ways to adapt. Others suggest that trauma was baked into the very structure of medieval marriage. That even in homes without outright violence, the imbalance of power made true intimacy nearly impossible, especially for young, unprepared brides. And yet some people survived. Some grew into their marriages. Some even over time found companionship or even love. But that came after the wedding night, after the pressure, the candles, the spying relatives, and the whispered prayers. What happened on that first night in too many cases was not about tenderness, it was about ownership, about sealing a contract with flesh and fear. So if you're imagining a shy kiss, a clumsy but sweet moment between two nervous people, hold on to that thought. It did happen sometimes, but far more often, the medieval wedding night was an experience endured, not shared, a test of compliance, not affection. And for the youngest, weakest, or most voiceless, it was something darker still. Now, if you thought the average noble wedding night was intense, imagine what it was like when the couple at the centre of it all was royal. Because when kings and queens consummated a marriage, it wasn't just personal, it was public policy. Wars hinged on it, treaties waited for confirmation, papal eyes squinted suspiciously from afar. The bedroom became a battleground of expectation, with privacy vanishing faster than a stable boy in a thunderstorm. Welcome to the royal rooms, where consummation was political theatre, and sometimes a horror show with a crown. Let's start with the basics. When royalty married, it was never just about love. That's obvious. Royal weddings were tools, blunt instruments used to unite kingdoms, crush rebellion, secure borders, and sometimes calm angry in-laws. The marriage had to be recognised by other powers, blessed by the church, and, most critically, consummated. Until that happened, it was all smoke and mirrors, and if it didn't happen, well, the entire alliance could collapse like a poorly made siege ladder. So how did they confirm it? You'd think they'd just take the couple's word. Nope, not even close. Royal consummations were often public events, not in the naked under a spotlight sense, thankfully, but certainly in the everyone is going to be very involved way. The newlyweds would be paraded to their chamber by an entourage of nobles, clergy, ladies-in-waiting, and pages. There would be music, there would be wine, there would be awkward jokes from elderly dukes who had way too much to drink at dinner. The bed, lavishly draped and perfumed, would be presented like a throne of flesh. Blessings were given, candles lit, people gathered around, and then they waited. Sometimes, literally. In extreme cases, especially when the political stakes were high, observers remained in the room. Some behind curtains, some perched in corners, not watching every detail, we hope, but listening, waiting for movement, for signs, for the telltale creak of the bed, or a shouted proclamation. "It is done," was an actual phrase used, sometimes shouted out a window, sometimes accompanied by the dramatic tossing of undergarments to waiting servants below. And once it was done, There had to be proof. A bloody sheet was the gold standard, carried out with ceremony and reverence. In one legendary account, a French king's marriage was declared valid only after the bloody linens were personally presented to his mother and verified by 2 bishops. Think about that. You've just had the most pressured experience of your life, and now your bedsheets are being judged by religious officials and your mother-in-law. But if no evidence appeared, oh boy, the consequences could be catastrophic. Kings have lost crowns, queens have been exiled, entire dynasties thrown into chaos over claims that a marriage wasn't properly consummated. Look at the infamous case of Anne of Cleves and Henry VIII. Their marriage lasted just 6 months, and while it's debated whether Henry actually tried to consummate it, he claimed she wasn't attractive enough and declared the union unconsummated. This gave him the legal escape route he needed to annul the marriage without beheading that particular wife. In earlier centuries, these royal disappointments could escalate even faster. In the 12th century, King Philip II of France tried to dump his Danish bride Ingeborg the day after the wedding, claiming she was too repellent to touch. She insisted they had consummated the marriage. He insisted she smelled weird and refused to let her near him again. What followed was 20 years of bitter legal warfare involving popes, excommunications, and several deeply embarrassed cardinals, all because of one night, or perhaps one night without enough noise. There's also the heartbreaking tale of Joanna of Castile, known to history as Juana la Loca, Juana the Mad. Her wedding night with Philip the Handsome was said to be so passionate that they didn't emerge for days. But that early fire quickly turned to ash. Philip cheated on her constantly, and rumours swirled that their consummation had been so intense it burned through her reason. Whether that's true or just more sexist storytelling is up for debate, but the point remains. Royal consummations could become legend, wielded as weapons in the hands of gossip and diplomacy alike. But not every royal wedding night ended in drama. Some just fizzled. Maybe the groom was sick. Maybe the bride fainted from nerves. Maybe both were terrified teenagers surrounded by 60 people chanting psalms. There are records of kings who delayed the consummation for days or weeks, claiming the bride was too young, or they themselves needed more time to prepare. And sometimes the bride was too young. But as you might expect by now, that didn't always stop the pressure to seal the deal early. And what about the couples who didn't want each other at all? Politics didn't ask. One of the cruelest truths about royal weddings was that personal preference didn't matter. You could be physically repulsed, emotionally detached, spiritually misaligned, it didn't matter. You had a duty to your country, your church, and your bloodline. If you didn't perform, someone else would do it for you, literally. In certain ancient royal customs, mostly rumours, but still disturbingly persistent, there were tales of stand-ins, proxies who consummated marriages in place of absent or unwilling spouses. There's no firm evidence this happened regularly, but the fact that people believed it could speaks volumes about how far the crown would go to protect its legitimacy. And then there's the fringe stuff. At least one chronicler from medieval Hungary wrote of a king who performed his own consummation beneath an canopy held by 4 bishops, with witnesses positioned at the corners of the bed to affirm the holiness of the union. Whether or not that's true is hard to say, but can you imagine the anxiety? Your bed becomes a chapel, your body a political tool, and your first shared moment with your new spouse is narrated by men in robes holding incense. Historians have long debated whether these ceremonies were the norm or just rare spectacles. Some argue that most royal couples were allowed a semblance of privacy, that the bedding ceremonies were largely symbolic. Others insist that the pressure to prove consummation was so intense, public confirmation was unavoidable. Either way, it's clear that for kings and queens, the wedding night wasn't a beginning. It was a performance, a trial, and failure meant more than just disappointment, it meant disaster. So if you find yourself draped in silk surrounded by courtiers who are way too invested in your bedtime activities, remember this: you're not being seduced, you're being surveilled. And if history is anything to go by, the crown on your pillow might be the heaviest thing you ever wear. So maybe you survived the candle-lit chaos of the royal wedding night. You shouted, "It is done, ma ba," with the gusto of a drunk bard, tossed your undergarments into the corridor, and hoped someone in a velvet robe scribbled it down in the book of things that legally matter. You'd think that'd be enough, right? Enough witnesses, enough ceremonial awkwardness, enough noise. But in some parts of medieval Europe there were still other eyes to contend with. eyes that belonged to the church, eyes that disturbingly often belonged to priests who felt it was their divine duty to not only bless your union, but also verify it. Which brings us to one of the most unsettling, intrusive, and often whispered about traditions of all, the ecclesiastical peep show. Let's get one thing straight. Clergy weren't exactly shy in medieval Europe. They wielded enormous influence over daily life, dictated rules on everything from diet to when you were allowed to have sex, and often had final say in the legal status of a marriage. But in some regions and periods, that authority extended all the way to the bedchamber. Not metaphorically, literally. In noble courts, especially in parts of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, the Church occasionally insisted on verifiable consummation. Why? Because marriage wasn't just a civil contract, it was a sacred sacrament. And if you didn't physically consummate the relationship, it wasn't spiritually complete. This became especially critical in cases involving land, bloodlines, or disputes about legitimacy. If a marriage came under question because someone wanted an annulment or because an inheritance was being contested, the church might step in to confirm the couple had completed the act. And when words weren't enough, out came the candles, the notaries, and the shifty glances. There are actual records, yes, written down by very serious men in robes, describing instances in which clergy, bishops, or monastic witnesses stood just outside the bedchamber, listening for signs. Sometimes it was subtle. A priest might stand at the door, say a blessing, and linger long enough to hear the rustling of linens. Other times less subtle, like the case of an archbishop in 13th century Spain who insisted on being present during the bedding of a noble couple involved in a high-stakes inheritance feud. He reportedly averted his gaze, which is the medieval version of "I totally didn't look, I swear," and then promptly signed an affidavit declaring the marriage valid. Super romantic. The need for this kind of verification wasn't always perverse, at least not from the church's perspective. It was about protecting the integrity of the sacrament. But let's not kid ourselves. Some clergy got very involved. There's one particularly infamous tale, possibly apocryphal, possibly not, of a priest in 15th century Italy who claimed he could sense whether a union had been consummated simply by standing in the room afterward and smelling the air. Yes, the air. The man considered himself a spiritual sommelier of post-coital ambience. If that doesn't ruin incense for you forever, I don't know what will. In especially high-profile or disputed cases, the couple might be asked to give testimony, under oath, about what had occurred. And not just did it happen, but detailed anatomical descriptions. The church had a disturbingly thorough checklist of what counted as valid penetration. Any ambiguity meant more questions. Was it complete? Was it partial? Was it obstructed? And if the answers didn't satisfy the tribunal, well, prepare for round 2. Under supervision. It gets worse. In rare cases, especially when the legitimacy of a royal heir was in doubt, couples were asked to reenact the act in front of a panel, not fully nude, but still alarmingly exposed. The man might be required to disrobe below the waist, present himself, and demonstrate readiness. The woman, veiled and partially clothed, might be asked to sit or lie beside him as they mimicked the consummation. The panel watched, nodded, and then declared whether it counted. It was less a honeymoon and more a live-action legal deposition featuring your genitals. And let's not forget the role of midwives. While their primary responsibility was childbirth, midwives were also sometimes deputized to examine new brides and confirm virginity, or its absence. After the wedding night, a midwife might be called to check for physical signs of consummation. This wasn't a medical procedure, it was theatre. The woman lay on her bed while someone poked, prodded, and made declarations based on what was at best deeply flawed science and, at worst, outright guesswork. But their word carried weight. A well-respected midwife's testimony could make or break a marriage's legal standing. You'd think clergy would be appalled by this kind of intrusion, and to be fair, some were. There are records of bishops and friars writing angry letters condemning these practices as indecent and unnecessary, but many others, especially those entangled in the politics of succession or regional alliances, went along with it. The idea that the church needed to guard the sanctity of marriage made it very easy to justify inserting themselves into the most private, vulnerable, and intimate parts of people's lives. Even among peasants, the influence of the church extended into the bedroom, though in less formal ways. Parish priests might ask probing questions during confession. Have you consummated your marriage? In what manner? Did you resist? Did you enjoy it too much? Yes, too much pleasure could be a red flag. Anything beyond the purpose of procreation was seen as suspicious, even sinful. Imagine going to confession and being scolded not just for having sex, but for liking it. Modern scholars still wrestle with how pervasive these practices actually were. Some believe the more dramatic examples, public bedding reenactments, sniff test clergy, were rare and exaggerated. Others argue that, particularly in high-profile marriages or contentious inheritance cases, these procedures were disturbingly common. What's not debated is this. The Church believed it had the right to inspect, confirm, and even oversee the most private moments of your life dabei. And if you resisted, you might find your marriage invalidated, your estate questioned, your spouse removed, and your reputation ruined. So tonight, as you lie beside your new partner, hoping for something as simple as peace and a good night's sleep, you're not just thinking about your spouse, you're wondering who else is thinking about you. What did they hear? What will they report? Will tomorrow bring congratulations or a summons to explain why no one saw the linen? Because in the medieval world, a wedding wasn't over when the bells stopped ringing. It was over when the priest said, "Yes, I believe they did it. Carry on." By now, you're probably wondering if every medieval marriage night followed this same humiliating script. Nervous glances, bloody linens, whispering clergy, and witnesses hanging around like overzealous theatre critics. But hold up, medieval Europe wasn't a monolith. It was a patchwork of cultures, customs, and contradictions. And if you step just slightly beyond the cloister walls or past the feasting hall, you'll find that what counted as normal in one place might have looked downright scandalous in another. Because as much as the Church tried to create a unified standard, the wedding night and everything it symbolised played out very differently depending on your faith, geography, and family tradition. Let's zoom in first on Christian Europe, where the Catholic Church's grip was strongest. This is the world we've been mostly exploring so far, heavily ritualised, deeply patriarchal, and utterly obsessed with virginity, consummation, and public proof. But even within Christian-dominated territories, there were huge variations. In some rural French villages, for instance, bedding ceremonies were relaxed affairs, more symbolic than literal. In Scandinavian communities, they often involved the bride being taken to bed by her female relatives, while the men sang bawdy songs around the hearth. Strange, yes, but not necessarily traumatic, just deeply awkward and full of ale. In contrast, southern Italy and parts of the Iberian Peninsula had a flair for more dramatic, sometimes even theatrical interpretations of the wedding night. Some noble households organised elaborate feasts centred around the couple's bedding, complete with performers and poetry meant to inspire fertility, or more accurately, to shame the couple into getting it over with. Elsewhere, especially in regions closer to Byzantine influence, the focus leaned more on formality and less on public verification. No linen parades, just knowing nods and subtle comments at breakfast like, "The moon smiled brightly last night." But now let's take a sharp turn to Jewish wedding traditions. In medieval Jewish communities across Europe and the Middle East, marriage was just as sacred, but the expectations around consummation were shaped by a completely different framework. First of all, the ketubah, the marriage contract, spelled out the rights and responsibilities of both spouses, and it wasn't just ceremonial, it had legal teeth. The couple was expected to consummate the marriage, yes, but there was no requirement for public proof, no bloody sheets, no elderly relatives loitering by the bed. Just the mutual understanding that the marriage was now physically and spiritually complete. Interestingly, in traditional Jewish law, a bride was expected to bathe in a mikveh, a ritual bath before the wedding symbolising purity and readiness. There were also guidelines about tenderness. Rabbinic texts encouraged men to approach their brides with patience and gentleness. Unlike the often cold instructions of Christian manuals, these emphasised the importance of mutual respect and even occasionally affection. Radical stuff for the Middle Ages. Still, expectations remained high. Virginity was valued, especially for brides from respected families. If a marriage fell apart or wasn't consummated, legal disputes could follow, though again they usually played out in rabbinical courts, not with torchlit bedroom trials. If the bride claimed she hadn't lost her virginity with her husband, it could lead to a financial dispute over the terms of the ketubah, or even annulment. But the drama tended to stay behind community doors, handled within religious boundaries rather than in public. Then there were Muslim communities. from Moorish Spain to parts of the Ottoman Empire and North Africa. Marriage in Islamic tradition was also a sacred contract, but the rituals and expectations of the wedding night followed their own logic. A nikah, or wedding ceremony, established the legal bond. After that, consummation was expected, but again it was a private matter, not a village-wide spectacle. In wealthier Muslim households, the bride was often escorted to her new home in a festive procession. Once there, she might be bathed, perfumed, and dressed in extravagant robes before being presented to her husband. The first night was expected to be tender, gentle, and full of symbolic meaning. There were poems written about it, instructions passed down, and a general awareness that this wasn't a race to the finish line, but the beginning of something holy. And yes, in some communities blood-stained sheets were still collected, especially among elite families in Al-Andalus and other Arabized parts of the medieval world. A cloth with proof of virginity might be presented discreetly to older relatives the next morning. But even then, it wasn't about legal validity, it was about family pride. Status. The subtext was the same, but the performance was far more muted. One of the most fascinating things about this cross-cultural comparison is how much each group borrowed from the others. Medieval cities were melting pots, especially in trade hubs like Toledo, Palermo, and Constantinople. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities often lived side by side, separated by law and ritual but deeply intertwined in daily life. Customs seeped across borders. A Christian family might borrow the bridal bath tradition. A Jewish merchant might adopt the Christian bridal procession, minus the wine-fueled bedding chants. Muslim nobility might incorporate Byzantine court rituals into their wedding feasts. The result? A web of shared, stolen and reshaped wedding night traditions that looked both wildly different and eerily familiar. Tensions between communities meant wedding customs could be weaponized. In Christian propaganda, Muslim wedding nights were portrayed as indulgent, lust-filled affairs, proof supposedly of moral weakness. Muslim scholars in turn wrote critiques of Christian weddings as joyless, repressive and obsessed with shame. Each side exaggerated the other's practices to prove superiority, when in reality both were juggling the same core themes: purity, duty, fertility and family reputation. Even within a single religion, class played a huge role. A wealthy Christian bride might be expected to deliver a sheet and a son. A peasant girl down the road might just be expected to show up to morning chores looking a little sleepy. Similarly, in Jewish and Muslim communities, expectations differed wildly between the urban elite and the countryside poor. Wealth didn't just buy better wedding feasts, it bought a bigger buffer zone between your bed and everyone else's opinion. Scholars are still unravelling these layers. How much was ritual? How much was community enforcement? How much was pure survival strategy wrapped in silk and scented oils? What's clear is that the wedding night wasn't just about sex. It was about identity. You weren't just becoming a spouse. You were stepping into a role shaped by centuries of law, tradition, theology, and deeply nosy aunties. So if you were a medieval bride, your experience could shift drastically depending on where you were born, what your faith taught you, and how high your family stood on the social ladder. You might be escorted to bed by torchbearers and choir boys. You might whisper vows over a glass of wine and sneak off quietly with your husband. Or you might close the door and for one rare moment, let the world outside pause. Because no matter the faith, the language, or the ritual on that night in that room, it was still two people facing each other in the glow of something ancient, sacred, and terrifyingly new. So let's say everything was going according to plan. Dowry exchanged, feast devoured, bedding ceremony endured with minimal sobbing. And then the unthinkable happens. You make it to the wedding night and it just doesn't work. Maybe he can't perform. Maybe she's too terrified to let it happen. Maybe nothing happens at all despite your best attempts and your aunt standing outside the door with a candle asking loudly if you need a helpful broth. In the medieval world, when a marriage refused to start with the necessary physical spark, people didn't just shrug and mutter awkward, they reached for explanations, and if human failure wasn't satisfying, well, there was always magic, or better yet, curses. Because when sex didn't go according to script, people rarely blamed poor communication, nerves, or, heaven forbid, a total lack of attraction. No, they looked for darker forces. If a marriage remained unconsummated beyond the first night, people assumed something or someone was interfering. And in an age when science and superstition shared the same lunch table, the explanation often pointed to witchcraft, curses, or magical meddling from an outside enemy. After all, if your son couldn't perform on his wedding night, it couldn't possibly be his fault. Clearly someone hexed his manhood. This wasn't just a peasant belief either. Nobles and royalty were just as likely to reach for magical scapegoats. In one particularly juicy case from 15th century Burgundy, a noblewoman accused her husband's ex-lover of casting a spell to make his staff of marriage wither whenever he approached his wife. The solution? A bishop, 2 midwives, and a suspiciously energetic herbalist all arrived to cleanse the bedroom. They sprinkled salt, burned sage, chanted prayers, and rubbed various oils on the bedposts. It didn't work. He was still flaccid, and the whole case ended up in court, where the poor man had to prove he could perform, just not with his wife. The verdict? Enchantment. Obviously. The belief in magical impotence, or ligature, as it was sometimes called, was widespread. In essence, ligature meant someone had tied, cursed, or otherwise spiritually blocked a man's ability to perform. This could be accomplished through enchanted knots, buried objects, herbs hidden under the mattress, or even words spoken during the wedding ceremony, by someone secretly wishing the couple ill. One famous example describes a rival lover tying 3 knots into a piece of red string, then burying it under a threshold the bride would cross. As long as the knots remained tied, the groom would remain, let's say, non-operational. To counter this, people turned to counter magic. Priests might bless the bed, bless the man, or perform an exorcism over his situation. Sometimes women would seek out local wise women, cunning folk, who knew spells to undo a binding. These charms were often just as ridiculous as the supposed curses they were trying to undo. Chant this phrase 7 times, sprinkle this powdered root over your husband's undergarments, and bury a frog at the crossroads. Worth a try, right? But the fear wasn't just about physical failure, it was about reputation. If a man couldn't consummate his marriage, his masculinity came under fire. His honour, his family's name, his very status as a man could be questioned. The stakes were high. The pressure to prove virility created real panic. It wasn't unusual for grooms to bring character witnesses, or even previous lovers, to court to testify that they'd had no trouble before the wedding. See, I was fine with that one, it must be the spell. Women didn't get off any easier. If a bride blocked her husband, resisted him, or even screamed too loudly, she might be accused of being cursed, or worse, being a witch herself. The logic was painfully twisted. If she wanted sex, she was immodest. If she didn't want sex, she was bewitched or malevolent. If she tried to explain that maybe she just needed a moment, or hadn't exactly been told what to expect, her voice was usually drowned out by louder opinions in Latin. Even more terrifying were the physical proofs people sought. Some midwives were tasked with examining women for unnatural tightness, assuming that if penetration couldn't happen, something had to be physically or magically wrong. There's one grim case from 14th century Germany where a bride was declared sealed by sorcery and was treated with invasive, painful methods that likely caused more damage than whatever problem had existed, if any did at all. The poor girl was 16, and yet not all stories ended in tragedy. In some cases, couples found ways to work around these difficulties. Maybe they tried again under different circumstances. Maybe they sought real medical advice, rudimentary as it was. A few records mention priests prescribing modesty herbs, or fertility-enhancing broths brewed with wine and honey and just a little ground wild thyme. Whether it helped is questionable, but the gesture meant people were trying and not just blaming. In more elite circles, these issues could now be handled with a kind of elegant discretion. If a nobleman couldn't consummate the marriage, he might be sent on a pilgrimage, ostensibly to find spiritual strength, but in reality to avoid the whispers. If he returned healed, all was forgiven. If not, the marriage could be quietly dissolved. For women, however, the options were limited. Unless the man admitted fault, she was stuck, trapped in a marriage that was neither affectionate nor legal in the eyes of the church, but fully binding in every practical way. And yet some women pushed back. There are remarkable records, few and far between, of brides demanding annulment on the basis of their husband's impotence, and winning. The process was humiliating. She had to testify. He had to be examined, sometimes in front of clergy and midwives. The courts weighed statements like, "His member is more like a child's," or "It swells, but not as a man's should." Horrifying, but if she prevailed, she could reclaim her dowry and even marry again. A rare kind of victory in a stacked system. Scholars still argue how common these magic-tinged failures really were. Some say they were exaggerated, part of folklore more than fact. Others argue they were widespread but suppressed in official records because of the shame involved. What's clear is that when the human body didn't cooperate, medieval minds scrambled for answers, often in the wrong places. Science wasn't there to explain nerves, trauma, or natural dysfunction, so people reached for knots, curses, and bad luck. So tonight, if the room is quiet, the fire has burned low, and one of you is staring blankly at the ceiling while the other pretends to sleep, don't worry. You're not broken. You're not cursed. You're just human. And maybe what you need isn't a potion, a blessing, or a frog buried at midnight. Maybe you just need time. But in the Middle Ages, time was a luxury few couples could afford, especially when the entire village was waiting for the bed to creak. All right, so let's say the wedding night was a success. Sort of. Sheets were stained, relatives were pleased, the church gave a nod of approval, and the town gossips ran out of new material. For now. You and your new spouse survived the rituals, the pressure, the parade, and maybe even found a tiny sliver of connection between all the incense and invasive scrutiny. But before you go congratulating yourself, here's something the storybooks left out. What comes after the wedding night could be far worse. Why? Because in medieval Europe, intimacy didn't just risk your dignity, it risked your life. Let's talk about the part no one sang songs about, sexually transmitted diseases, or as they were often called back then, God's punishments, unclean afflictions, or the curse of carnal sin. Catchy names, but behind the moral judgment was a grim, terrifying reality. The medieval world didn't have antibiotics. It didn't have condoms, unless you count linen soaked in vinegar and tied on with hope. It didn't even have a full understanding of what germs were. So when a disease started eating away at your body from the inside out, people blamed lust, demons, bad air, or some unfortunate knight with that overly friendly stable hand. Let's start with the heavy hitter, syphilis. Now, there's still some scholarly debate about whether syphilis existed in Europe before the late 15th century, or whether it was brought back by sailors after Columbus's voyage to the Americas. But something was out there. People were getting sores in unpleasant places, teeth were falling out, skin was rotting, and the symptoms showed up not just in brothels or battlefields, but in marriage beds, especially when the groom had been, shall we say, less than monogamous prior to the wedding. In some noble households, it wasn't unusual for a groom to arrive at the altar already carrying a venereal disease. Why? Because noblemen often had mistresses, lovers, even entire unofficial families before tying the knot. Marriage wasn't about love, remember? It was about alliance, legacy, and producing heirs. So a man might spend years gallivanting through Europe's most fashionable beds before finally marrying a young, innocent bride who had no idea she was about to inherit something extra along with the estate. There are tragic cases, more than a few, of young brides who fell mysteriously ill not long after their weddings. Their hair fell out, their skin broke into ulcers, some went blind, others miscarried again and again until their bodies simply gave out. Most weren't diagnosed with anything more specific than wasting illness or corruption of the womb. But we know now what they were probably suffering from: untreated, advanced stage STDs. And it wasn't just syphilis. There were plenty of other unpleasant visitors lurking in the medieval bedroom. Gonorrhea, for instance, was sometimes referred to as the drip or the burning. Charming. Chlamydia existed, though it often went undiagnosed, especially in women, whose symptoms were subtler and frequently blamed on hysteria, demonic possession, or bad luck. Any sign of discomfort in the nether regions was seen through a spiritual lens. You didn't need a physician, you needed confession, or an exorcism. Of course, medicine wasn't totally absent. If you were brave or desperate enough to visit a barber surgeon or apothecary, you might be prescribed a poultice of herbs, mercury ointment, yes, mercury, or bloodletting. Some physicians suggested leech therapy, because if your private parts are falling apart, what better solution than inviting a blood-sucking slug to set up shop? There were also herbal remedies. Rosemary, thyme, garlic, and even powdered antlers were boiled, rubbed, or inserted into places no antler should ever go. Unsurprisingly, most of these did nothing, or made things worse. And if you were a woman, God help you, because not only were you likely to suffer in silence, but your illness might be interpreted as a punishment. People believed that women who experienced pain during sex were paying for their sins, or worse, had been cursed. Some believed that promiscuous women rotted from the inside out. Even a chaste bride who fell ill after her wedding might be accused of infidelity, even witchcraft. After all, if the groom was fine, it must be her fault. That logic was ironclad and completely wrong. Among the lower classes, the problem was compounded by lack of access to any form of treatment, no matter how dubious. If you were a peasant, your options were limited to superstitions, home remedies, or just suffering quietly and hoping you didn't die before the harvest. You might smear honey on a sore, you might drink a concoction of nettle water and chalk. You might just pretend everything was fine until it wasn't, and when you died, someone might mutter that you'd been unclean in the eyes of the Lord. But perhaps the most heartbreaking reality was the impact on fertility. One of the most common consequences of untreated STDs is infertility, and in the medieval world, infertility wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a social death sentence. A wife who couldn't conceive might be cast aside, accused of being barren, cursed, or a bad omen. A husband who couldn't father children would be quietly mocked, or loudly replaced. In noble families, a barren marriage meant no heir, no legacy, and no peace. That made the wedding night not just the start of a marriage, but the beginning of an unrelenting countdown. There's a fringe theory, still debated among historians, that some nobles, aware of their own infections, deliberately delayed consummation for fear of infecting their new bride. But in most cases, ignorance ruled. If you didn't show outward symptoms, you assumed you were fine. Even if your partner got sick later, there was always someone else to blame. The devil, the last town you passed through, that sketchy fig vendor in Naples, anyone but yourself. And let's not forget the church's role in all this. In theory, priests were supposed to counsel couples toward modesty and chastity. In practice, they often ignored sexual health altogether, or treated it as a moral failing rather than a medical issue. If you were suffering, they told you to pray. If that didn't work, you clearly weren't praying hard enough. So here you are, lying next to someone who until yesterday was mostly a stranger. You've survived the public spectacle, the blood-soaked proofs, the family inspections, but now you're entering a quiet, dangerous new phase, one where your health, your future children, and your very survival might depend on decisions made by others, decisions wrapped in silk and shame and silence. Because in medieval Europe, the wedding night didn't just mark the beginning of your life together. Sometimes it marked the start of a slow, painful end. So you've made it through the physical side of the wedding night, the awkward inspections, the potential curses, and even the ever-looming threat of disease. But don't start fluffing the featherbed just yet, because now you're about to face a challenge that medieval couples dreaded even more than a moody bishop or an uncooperative bedsheet: the expectation to procreate. That's right. As soon as the bed was warmed, people expected it to be fruitful. Because in the medieval world, a marriage without children was like a sword without a blade, technically complete but embarrassingly useless. Children weren't just nice to have, they were essential. For peasants, they were labour. For merchants, they were legacy. And for nobles, they were everything. No heir meant no future, no daughter meant no alliance, and no child at all. That meant the entire marriage was suddenly under scrutiny, and so were you. Because when babies didn't arrive on schedule, the whispering started. Not from behind closed doors, but right in your face at the market, in church pews, and worst of all during family dinners. Let's start with how long you had before concern turned into crisis. In most communities, couples were given a grace period, usually a year, one solid calendar-marked year in which you were expected to produce signs of fertility, or at least show promising symptoms. That meant no sudden illnesses, no mysterious absences from the marital bed, and definitely no rumours that you and your spouse were not quite getting along. Because in the absence of a bump or a baptism, people made assumptions, and of course the first person to get blamed, the wife. If a marriage remained childless, the suspicion almost always fell on the woman. She was barren, cursed, withheld by Yah. Her womb was defective, her spirit was impure, maybe she'd committed some hidden sin in her youth, danced too freely at a feast, looked too long at a monk, failed to light a candle at her grandmother's funeral. Some even believed a woman's uterus could wander around the body, getting lost and making conception impossible unless it was coaxed back into place with incense or strategic poking. Yes, truly. But if it wasn't the womb, then it must have been the devil. Infertility wasn't just a biological mystery, it was often seen as spiritual sabotage. A couple who couldn't conceive might be accused of being under a demonic influence. Maybe they'd been cursed at their wedding. Maybe someone had slipped a piece of iron under the marriage bed, a classic hex against conception. Or maybe, just maybe, God was punishing them. For what? Oh, anything. Skipping mass, having impure thoughts, or heaven forbid, enjoying sex too much. You really couldn't win. Now, if the couple did want children, they weren't exactly working with a robust manual. Medieval ideas about conception were, well, let's just say creative. Some thought pregnancy required not just penetration but mutual orgasm. Others believed a woman's seed had to rise and meet the man's inside her body like two ships docking at night. Timing was also a guess. Most agreed that spring was the best season for baby making, what with all the blooming flowers and symbolic fertility, but nobody really knew what ovulation was. It was more about astrology than biology. And when nature didn't cooperate, people turned to remedies. These ranged from the surprisingly reasonable, like herbal teas made from nettles, cinnamon, or mugwort, to the absolutely unhinged. There were recipes for fertility potions that included pigeon droppings, dried eel skin, and even a powder made from ground antlers and boiled owl bones. Some women were told to place warm stones on their stomachs. Others lay with their legs tied up for hours after intercourse, as if gravity might finally do what prayer and potions couldn't. If nothing worked, some couples took pilgrimages to fertility shrines. These weren't quiet retreats. They were bustling, desperate hubs of hope. In England, women trekked to the shrine of St. Margaret, protector of childbirth. In Spain, St. Marina. In France, St. Anne. They'd leave offerings, ribbons, coins, even locks of hair. They'd pray, light candles, and in extreme cases, drink water that had bathed the saints' relics. Imagine sipping from a cup that just held a 300-year-old rib fragment and telling yourself it was all going to work out. Still no baby. Then came the accusations. In peasant communities, people blamed witches. It wasn't uncommon for a barren woman to accuse her neighbour of hexing her fertility. In noble households, the blame shifted from the spiritual to the political. Families grew suspicious. Was the wife secretly sabotaging the lineage? Was the husband incapable and covering it up? Was there a rival trying to curse the household from within? Because again, it wasn't just about children, it was about power. An heir meant security. No heir meant someone else could swoop in and take it all. That pressure could twist a marriage beyond recognition. Even if the couple cared for each other, rare, but not impossible. The constant anxiety about fertility could hollow them out. Some women grew paranoid, consulting every midwife, herbalist, or passing traveller with a pouch of miracle dust. Some men turned to the church asking for spiritual audits or marriage blessings. Others, especially nobles, sought out mistresses to test their own virility. If the mistress got pregnant, it proved the wife was to blame. If she didn't, well, then it was time for another pilgrimage, or a different mistress. And occasionally, in the bleakest of solutions, couples faked it. They might adopt a child and claim it was their own. They might bribe a midwife to produce a newborn from the countryside and pass it off as the legitimate heir. Some even paid young maidservants to sleep with the husband in secret, and then deliver the baby into the household under the guise of a natural birth. Everyone pretended not to know, because at the end of the day, appearance mattered more than truth. Historians still debate how much agency women had in these situations. Some argue that upper-class women wielded surprising influence behind the scenes, choosing midwives, coordinating remedies, even negotiating with spiritual advisors. Others insist that once a marriage was declared barren, the woman had almost no say in what came next. Divorce wasn't an option. Annulment required painful public trials, and the prospect of being sent back to your father's house as a failed wife, devastating. So you see, the wedding night was never just about sex. It was a starting pistol. From the moment the first moan was heard or not heard, people started counting. 9 months, 12 months, 18, tick-tock, every quiet dinner, every sideways glance, every fainting spell would be dissected for signs of pregnancy. And if none came, the silence would grow louder than the bells on your wedding day. Because in the medieval world, love was optional, loyalty was expected, but fertility? That was mandatory. Let's say luck was finally on your side. The rituals were done, the sheets were stained, hopefully with the right kind of proof, the relatives left your chamber eventually, and, miracle of miracles, your body started showing the signs everyone had been waiting for. Swollen ankles, odd cravings, morning sickness, though of course no one called it that. The phrase of the day was more like the quickening of life. and your belly became a holy relic, the precious centerpiece of your now officially legitimate marriage. But just because the medieval world worshipped fertility didn't mean it treated pregnant women like queens. In fact, your wedding night had only set the stage up for the next ordeal: surviving pregnancy, childbirth, and the nearly impossible expectations that came after. Because if the wedding night was about sealing the deal, the months that followed were all about delivering the goods. And if you think that's a crude way to put it, you're absolutely right. But that's also how it felt. Once you were pregnant, you were less of a person and more of a vessel. A walking cradle, a living, breathing hope for lineage. The family, especially if it was noble, treated your body like a leased estate, tended carefully, monitored constantly, but ultimately not yours. At first, things might feel exciting. Congratulations flutter in. Small gifts, mostly tokens of hope or protection. Ribbons, fertility charms, carved ivory saints. Midwives visit to feel your belly and nod with solemn importance, as if they can already tell if it's a boy or girl. They can't, but they'll pretend. You're instructed to eat certain foods, soft cheeses, eggs, fish with heads still attached, maybe a spoonful of honey stirred with silver. You're also told what not to eat, which includes just about everything delicious, spicy, or fun. And, depending on the region, you might be advised to stop having sex altogether. Or, conversely, told it was essential for a healthy baby. Medieval medicine, folks, is a dartboard. Now, your pregnancy isn't a secret. There's no quiet first trimester in this world. The entire household watches your every movement for signs. Did she vomit after breakfast? That's a girl. Does she crave onions? Must be a boy. Does she sneeze too violently while churning butter? That's probably twins. Every cough, every yawn, every sigh becomes evidence in someone's theory. And just like the wedding night, privacy is basically non-existent. If you're lucky, you might be allowed to rest more. But in many households, especially among the working class, you'll still be expected to cook, clean, and even harvest crops until you're visibly unable to bend at the waist. Morning sickness. Offer it up to God and go milk the goat. And then, of course, there are the prayers. Oh, so many prayers. Your mother-in-law prays. The midwife prays. The local priest stops by to rub holy water on your stomach while muttering Latin invocations that sound less like blessings and more like a passive-aggressive warning to behave. Because here's the thing. Childbirth is a minefield. One wrong turn, one uncooperative contraction, and both mother and baby might be lost. And if that happens, guess who gets the blame? Spoiler alert, it's not the baby. In the medieval imagination, pregnancy and childbirth were just as much moral tests as physical ones. If you died in labour, it might be interpreted as divine punishment. Maybe you hadn't confessed often enough. Maybe you'd harboured sinful thoughts. Maybe you had, gasp, enjoyed the wedding night more than you should have. Scholars still debate just how much guilt and fear were pressed onto pregnant women, but records show that many approached labour like a condemned prisoner facing trial. Not with joy, but dread, and a desperate hope that their soul was in good enough standing for what came next. The birthing room itself was both sacred and strange. When the time came, men were usually banned, except for desperate cases or royal physicians. The room was sealed, the windows covered, and only women were allowed to remain, midwives, older relatives, and sometimes a few close friends. Herbs were burned, candles lit, charms hung from doorframes. St. Margaret, patroness of childbirth, was invoked repeatedly, often by name, sometimes with tiny figurines placed beneath the labouring mother's pillow. The process, brutal. No anaesthesia, no epidurals. If the baby came out breech, they had to reach in and turn it, by hand. If the mother bled too much, there were no transfusions. If the cord wrapped around the baby's neck, the midwife had to cut and tie and hope. In some places, labouring women were given alcohol, wine, ale, even spiced brandy to dull the pain. Others received a concoction called mother's draught, a mixture of herbs and oil, meant to help dilate the cervix. Results were mixed. But here's where things get truly medieval. If labour went on too long, the priest was summoned, not to help, to administer last rites, just in case. Imagine that, being in the middle of the worst physical agony of your life and having someone anoint your forehead with holy oil, preparing your soul for death. Comforting, right? And yet somehow many women survived. And when they did, they didn't get a rest. Oh no. As soon as the baby was out and the cord cut by candlelight with dull scissors or sometimes a blessed knife, the attention shifted. Was the baby breathing, crying, baptized? because in the eyes of the church no child was truly safe until water touched its head. Unbaptized babies, should they die, were believed to hover in a spiritual limbo, denied entry to heaven. So midwives often performed emergency baptisms in the birthing room if things looked grim. No time for celebration, just salt water and whispered Latin. And what about the father? Well, he was usually outside, pacing, praying, or drinking. Occasionally, noblemen were invited in after the fact to admire the baby and bestow a name. Peasant husbands might come in to wrap the child in cloth or stoke the fire, but for the most part, birth was women's work, which in medieval terms meant sacred, terrifying, and entirely unsupported. After childbirth, the mother still wasn't out of danger. Postpartum infections were common and often fatal. Bleeding, fever, or retained placenta could kill a woman within hours. If she survived, she was considered unclean for a set period, anywhere from 20 to 40 days, and wasn't allowed back into church until she underwent a ritual known as churching. It was a kind of spiritual reset, a public cleansing that allowed her to rejoin society. Because apparently surviving childbirth wasn't enough, you also needed to be blessed back into existence. So yes, your wedding night may have been awkward, messy, or downright miserable, but it was just the prologue. The real test came later, in a small dark room with boiling water, ragged towels, and the sound of prayers layered over screams. And if you made it through all that, congratulations, you were now a real wife. Not just because you had sex, but because you had lived through what came after. Because in medieval Europe, becoming a bride was a public event. But becoming a mother, that was a gamble with everything on the line. Let's say you survived childbirth. You made it through the blood, the panic, the hot herbal compresses, the salt on the windowsill, and the midwife muttering, "St. Margaret, protect her," under her breath. You're alive. The baby's alive. The priest has come and gone. The holy water has been splashed, and you've been tucked into a sweat-soaked, straw-stuffed bed like some fragile artifact that mustn't be moved. You might expect rest, recovery, a bit of quiet, but no, because now begins the second round of scrutiny, the one where everyone watches not your bed, but your behaviour. Because if the wedding night tested your body, motherhood was going to test your soul. And just to be clear, motherhood didn't start once your child could walk or talk or even recognise your face. No, it started immediately. As in, she hasn't fed the baby yet? Immediately, medieval society had very clear ideas about what a new mother should do, look like, and feel. And if you deviated from the script even a little, if you wept too much, bled too long, asked too many questions, or heaven forbid seemed tired, you were instantly suspect. Maybe something was wrong with your spirit. Maybe your body had been weakened by sin. Or maybe, worst of all, you weren't cut out for motherhood after all. First and foremost, you were expected to nurse the baby. Breastfeeding wasn't optional. It was practically a sacrament. Sure, noble families often hired wet nurses, but even that decision was heavily scrutinised. A woman who refused to nurse her own child was viewed with suspicion. What was she doing with her time if not feeding her infant? Was she indulging in vanity, avoiding the natural order of things? There were entire sermons about the dangers of a mother's cold milk or withholding breast, suggesting that maternal selfishness could stunt a child's soul. Yikes. And don't get comfortable even if you wanted to nurse. Because that came with its own load of rules and myths. You had to watch what you ate. No garlic, no onions, nothing sharp or hot, lest your milk turn bitter and poison the baby. You couldn't get angry or sad while feeding because your emotional state was believed to pass directly into the child through the milk. And if your husband tried to, let's say, reconnect too soon after childbirth, nope, forbidden. Sex was thought to curdle the milk and ruin everything. If he insisted anyway, well, clearly you were at fault for being too tempting. Speaking of sex, it was expected to resume eventually, yes, even after all that trauma. Church law forbade intercourse for a set period, usually 40 days, but once you were churched and declared spiritually clean again, the marital duties resumed. Ready or not, whether your body had healed, whether you were mentally prepared, whether the thought of intimacy made you want to weep into a sack of barley, all irrelevant. The marriage needed to stay active. Another child was expected, preferably a son this time. And let's not forget the social performance. You were no longer just wife or daughter-in-law, you were mother, capital M, with all the baggage that came with it. You had to be nurturing but not indulgent, tough but not cruel, pious but not self-righteous, patient, always, and joyful, preferably with that kind of exhausted serenity that made the older women in the village nod approvingly. Show too much pain or frustration and they might whisper you are weak. Show too little and you might be accused of being heartless or even unnatural. If something happened to the baby, all eyes turned to you. Infant mortality was tragically common in the Middle Ages. A third to half of all children died before the age of 5, and when they did, grief wasn't private. Everyone watched how you reacted. Were you hysterical? That was undignified. Too calm? Clearly suspicious. Some women who lost their babies were accused of negligence, others of witchcraft. There are heartbreaking records of mothers hauled before church courts to answer for their child's sudden death. Some after being widowed, others while still bleeding from childbirth. Their crime, not crying the right amount or at the right volume. And yes, there were the saints. Oh, the saints. You were expected to model your motherhood after the Virgin Mary herself. Gentle, obedient, and endlessly giving. Never mind that she only had the one child and a direct line to divine protection. You were held to her standard anyway, and if you didn't live up to it, well, maybe you weren't chosen. Maybe God was testing you, or maybe you needed to fast and pray harder until you could perform your role without faltering. It didn't end with babyhood. As the child grew, your responsibilities only expanded. Education, mostly religious, nutrition based on guesswork and superstition, protection from disease, demons, and those sinister-looking mushrooms the neighbour's kid keeps picking. You were expected to monitor your child's behaviour, future marriage prospects, and general morality, all while remaining subordinate to your husband and endlessly deferent to his family. But even in this mess, women found small rebellions. They swapped herbal remedies behind the midwife's back, whispered warnings about difficult husbands, hid their grief in embroidery and their anger in lullabies. Some formed deep, unshakable bonds with their children, especially daughters, who were often raised to take over the same roles, wrapped in the same rules. And when things got bad, when the church or the family, or even the child itself turned cold, some women simply disappeared, left behind anonymous notes in convents, sought out the edges of towns, walked away in whatever small ways they could. Historians still debate how much actual power mothers had in this world. Some argue that behind closed doors they ruled their households. Others insist they were treated like walking wombs, disposable if they failed. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the messy middle. Women were revered and restricted, idealized and ignored, essential and expendable. And their stories, real stories, with blood and breath and broken fingernails, were mostly left off the official scrolls. So no, the wedding night wasn't the climax of your medieval marriage. It was the opening curtain. What followed was years of performance, often without applause. Feeding, bearing, raising, burying, serving your husband, the church, the estate, and your children, all while trying to survive in a world that expected you to be a saint but treated you like a servant. Because in the end, for a medieval bride, survival wasn't just about the wedding night. It was about everything after. The part no one put in the songs. Now, let's step back and breathe for a moment. You've made it this far, from awkward wedding night rituals to the exhausting gauntlet of childbearing, and somehow you're still upright, possibly with a toddler clinging to your skirts and a baby on your hip. But what happens if the marriage, the one sealed with church bells, legal scrolls, and an entire roomful of tipsy relatives, starts to crumble? What if your charming new husband turns out to be less man of God, and more man who forgets where his bed is 3 nights a week? Or worse, what if he's cruel, violent, or entirely absent? In the modern world, you'd get a lawyer. In the medieval world, you got a mess. Because for all the energy spent on the wedding night, there was almost no escape hatch once things went south. Marriage in medieval Europe was considered indissoluble. Once you were in, you were in. Divorce, forget it. The church didn't allow it. Marriage was a sacrament, like baptism or the Eucharist, and you couldn't undo sacraments just because your husband smelled like a dead pig and hadn't touched you since Pentecost. You might be miserable, broken, or on the brink of total emotional collapse, but you were still married. The church's position was clear: suffer well and offer it up. Now that's not to say there weren't workarounds, just that they were rare, expensive and humiliating. The most common legal loophole was annulment, which said your marriage had never been valid in the first place. Usually this was granted only if the marriage hadn't been consummated and you had proof. or if you were secretly related to your spouse in a way that violated canon law. Like if your great-uncle and his great-aunt once shared a goat or some convoluted nonsense that made you too close by blood. You'd be amazed how often noble families discovered just such a connection when the marriage turned sour. But to get an annulment, you needed witnesses, clerical support, and usually a lot of money. The process was slow and deeply invasive. Imagine trying to argue in front of a church tribunal that your husband never actually touched you, while he sits nearby claiming he did, frequently and with gusto. There are records of women being asked to describe the exact dimensions of their husband's anatomy, as well as the frequency and success of their attempts. If your answers didn't satisfy the judges, you were stuck, or worse, branded a liar. And let's not pretend the man suffered equally. A husband who wanted out had far more tools. He could accuse his wife of adultery, infertility, or witchcraft. All dangerous claims. If he succeeded, she could be stripped of her dowry, her children, and her reputation. Some women fled before this happened, disappearing into convents or begging their families to take them back. But once married, a woman technically belonged to her husband. Her property, her children, even her legal identity were considered under his control. So leaving wasn't just frowned upon, it was almost impossible. But what about abuse? Could a woman leave if her husband beat her? It depended. In theory, yes. Church courts occasionally allowed separation from bed and board in extreme cases of cruelty. But separation wasn't divorce. You were still legally married. You just didn't have to live together. Even then, you had to prove the abuse was ongoing, intentional and grievous. Broken bones helped your case. Emotional abuse? Not so much. And good luck finding anyone willing to testify against your husband, especially if he was wealthy or well-connected. Still, there are a few stories, rare but real, of women who fought back. One English woman in the 14th century actually took her husband to court, not once but twice after he repeatedly beat her and tried to pawn their children. The records show she eventually won a formal separation and custody of her youngest child. Another woman in France reportedly disguised herself as a man to escape her abusive husband and lived for years under an assumed name, working as a scribe. When she was finally discovered, the local bishop let her off with a warning, impressed apparently by her ingenuity. Among the lower classes, the options were fewer still. Peasant marriages were often too informal to fall under legal scrutiny, yet still tightly controlled by custom. If a man wanted to leave his wife, he sometimes just left. Off to war, off to another town, off to a new family. The wife was left behind to fend for herself, her status legally ambiguous. If she remarried, she could be charged with bigamy. If she didn't, she might starve. There are stories of women forging letters from missing husbands, declaring themselves widowed so they could marry again and regain some kind of life. Risky, but sometimes better than waiting forever. As for cheating, that was another matter entirely. Men, of course, were expected to be unfaithful. Not officially, but culturally it was considered almost inevitable. Boys will be boys, except the phrase back then was more like, the Lord understands male nature. Noblemen kept mistresses openly, even bringing them into the household. If a wife complained, she might be mocked or ignored. If she cheated, however, the consequences could be fatal. An unfaithful wife risked everything. If caught, she could be cast out, imprisoned, or even executed. Noble women were sometimes confined to towers or convents, while commoners might be paraded through the streets or branded. There's one bleak tale from northern Italy about a young woman who was sewn into a sack with a dog, a rooster, and a snake, then tossed into a river. That was the punishment for adultery in some regions. Death by zoological nightmare. Was it common? Probably not. Was it possible? Absolutely. And yet, again, some women found their own solutions. Quiet affairs, secret letters passed through servants, coded embroidery, and, in the rarest cases, love affairs that turned into full-blown elopements. One noblewoman in 13th century France disappeared with a visiting troubadour, abandoning her estate and husband. She was hunted down, brought back, and publicly humiliated. But according to one letter discovered years later, she never regretted it. So what held all this chaos together? Why didn't the entire institution of marriage collapse under the weight of its contradictions? The answer is both simple and devastating. Because women had few other choices. Marriage, even when miserable, offered a kind of stability. social standing, a roof, children, a role. Leaving meant exile, staying meant sacrifice, and in that terrible space in between, countless women lived, endured, and occasionally quietly rebelled. Because in medieval Europe, the wedding night wasn't the end of the story. It was the start of a contract, and while love might have been optional, obedience was not. So here you are, years later, this man woman to be So here you are, years later, perhaps decades if you're lucky, worn down but still standing, carrying not just the memory of that wedding night, but the full weight of everything that came after. You've survived the rituals, the pregnancies, the expectations, the judgments. You've grown into the role that was handed to you, maybe gracefully, maybe bitterly, probably with some mix of both. And yet for all the ways marriage has shaped you, the one thing it never promised was permanence. Because no matter how solid the vows, how many children you've borne, or how dutifully you've served, your status as wife could still vanish in the blink of a death. Or worse, a succession. See, in the medieval world, even the most seasoned wife was always walking a tightrope. One slip, one change in fortune, one shift in political winds, and you could tumble from matron to widow, from power to irrelevance, from honoured spouse to expendable relic. And in that final phase, after the wedding nights and the childbirths and the years of managing households and estates, you'd face the last, most uncertain chapter of all. What happens to the wife when the marriage ends? Let's start with the cleanest break: death. Statistically speaking, your husband was more likely to die first, especially if he was older, which many were, and at first glance widowhood might seem like a sort of freedom. No more marital duties, no more scrutiny, no more risk of pregnancy or forced affection. Some women even found a second life in widowhood, taking control of property, managing estates, or entering religious life on their own terms. Among noble women, the term vidua venerabilis, venerable widow, was sometimes used to describe this respectable, semi-powerful figure who commanded influence from the shadows. But before you start picturing peaceful gardens and quiet prayer, let's not get carried away, because being a widow came with its own set of traps. First of all, your social standing was now entirely dependent on the generosity of your late husband's will, and if he didn't leave one, or left one that conveniently forgot your name, you could find yourself tossed out like last season's harvest. Some families welcomed the widow back, especially if she brought a dowry or children. Others treated her like unwanted inventory, expensive to keep, too awkward as to marry off again. And yes, remarrying was often expected. Especially for younger widows, anyone under 40 was still considered marriageable, though the church started side-eyeing second marriages after the first two. A widow might be forced into another political match or married off quickly to consolidate land. In many regions, a woman's consent wasn't even required for the second go-round, especially if her father or eldest son now held legal guardianship over her. So while your first wedding night might have been traumatic, your second could be downright surreal, especially when it came with fewer festivities and even less autonomy. But remarriage wasn't just a social pressure, it was often a legal necessity. In many medieval regions, property rights, inheritance, and even the ability to stay in your home depended on whether you were actively married. A widow who refused to remarry might find her children's futures jeopardized. She might be cut off from estate income, denied access to livestock, or forced to return her dower lands. Independence came at a steep price, and was only an option for those with extraordinary luck, unusual wealth, or powerful allies. On the flip side, if you died first, things got even more complicated, because your body became a symbol, a kind of ghostly performance piece for whatever legacy your marriage had left behind. A good wife was mourned properly. Veils, processions, maybe a carved tomb with her hands clasped in prayer. A not-so-good wife? She might be buried in a side plot with no marker at all, her name gradually erased from the household memory. And even in death, your reputation could be debated. Was she faithful? Was she fruitful? Did she cause trouble? Did she die in childbirth or in sin? For noble families, your memory was a political tool. If your children succeeded, you were praised as a pious, dutiful mother. If they failed, or died, you were conveniently blamed. Her blood was weak, they'd say. Her prayers weren't strong enough. The stories got reshaped to fit whatever version of you suited the living. And if your husband remarried, which he likely would, you'd be replaced not just in bed, but in history. The new wife would wear your jewellery, raise your children, maybe even sleep in the same sheets, and your name would start to fade. But some women refused to fade. They left behind letters, wills, patronages, some built chapels, others commissioned artwork that preserved their image, stern and severe, cloaked in black, eyes fixed eternally forward. A few dictated their life stories to scribes, or paid for masses to be said in their names for centuries after their deaths. These weren't grand romantic gestures, they were power moves. Because in a world where you could be erased so easily, memorialising yourself was a radical act. One famous widow, Marjorie Kempe, wrote, well dictated, what is now considered the first autobiography in English. Her marriage, her spiritual visions, her breakdowns, all laid bare in scandalous detail. She refused to disappear quietly, travelling across Europe on pilgrimages, weeping in public, challenging priests, and documenting every second of it. Was she widely ridiculed? Yes, but she also ensured that her voice would echo long after her body failed. That's one way to fight erasure, with a pen instead of a sword. Even among the peasantry, stories survive of women who reclaimed control in widowhood. Running inns, selling herbs, even becoming midwives or cunning women, roles that gave them a kind of untouchable authority. Some were feared, others respected, but they were noticed, and in a world that preferred its wives quiet and compliant, that alone was subversive. And what about the fringe cases, the ones who faked death, fled across borders, or vanished into convents under false names? Those women became myths. The wife who became a monk, the mother who disappeared into the forest, the bride who returned 20 years later with a caravan of horses and gold. These were whispered in kitchens and by firesides, half truth, half fantasy, but always with that unmistakable thread of hope, that maybe you didn't have to be defined by one night in one bed with one man. So yes, the wedding night mattered. It was the beginning of everything: sex, scrutiny, survival. But what came after was 1,000 times messier, more painful and more quietly heroic, because being a medieval wife wasn't about lace and laughter. It was about endurance, reinvention, invisible strength, and the hope that, even if your name didn't end up in the history books, your legacy might still survive in a whispered story, a stubborn child, or a grave that someone still visited long after the world forgot why. So here we are at the end. Not just the end of your marriage story, but the end of a journey that probably felt less like a romantic tale, and more like a marathon through quicksand, with an audience of disapproving monks, gossipy neighbours, and a midwife who always smelled vaguely of boiled onions. From the moment you said "I do," or more likely had it said for you, your life twisted into something narrow and predefined, a role carved by centuries of theology, superstition, politics, and a deeply uncomfortable obsession with your body. You weren't a wife so much as a stage upon which everyone else's expectations were performed. Your wedding night wasn't candle-lit romance, it was a legal checkpoint. A noisy, awkward, sometimes humiliating checkpoint meant to prove your worth, your obedience, and the readiness of your womb. You were expected to produce proof, to be gracious, to bear pain in silence and pleasure in even deeper silence. And then, when morning came and the sheets were inspected, you were expected to smile and prepare for the long road ahead. Childbirth, domestic duties, social manoeuvring, maybe even survival in a marriage that didn't care much whether you were happy, just whether you were useful. And yet through it all you endured. Somehow women made lives in this system. They found moments of love, resilience, rebellion. They raised children with more tenderness than the world offered them. They buried grief in lullabies, stitched secrets into seams, turned kitchens into sanctuaries and courtrooms into battlegrounds. They learned when to bite their tongues and when to speak, even if it was only in whispers. And the few who dared to break the mould, to run, to write, to rule in their own right, they left cracks in the walls that still echo today. Tonight, as the candle of this story flickers low, maybe you're lying in bed wondering how any of them did it. How they stood there in itchy lace, 100 eyes watching, and said yes to a life that offered so little control. The answer is both devastating and quietly powerful. They did it because they had to, but also because some of them believed that maybe, just maybe, things could be different for those who came next. And that's what we carry forward, isn't it? Not the rituals, not the shame, not the blood-soaked sheets, but the whispered dreams passed down from mother to daughter, servant to lady, widow to bride, that you are more than a ceremony, more than a role, more than what happens in a candlelit room full of expectations. So blow out the candle, pull the blankets close, and know that somewhere, in a time not so different from this one, someone else lay awake too, wondering what came next.